Chapter 1806. In this unknown space-time dimension between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, 30 million years had passed since Luo Fan, who had more than 100 million different space-time dimensions, had directly manifested his own worldview. Of course, this was only the feeling of each Luo Fan in this place. In the dusky existence between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, time itself was not fixed. However, to Luo Fan, who could travel between different space-time dimensions, this was nothing at all. It would not pose any obstacle to them. It was as if they were in a normal time and space, passing every minute and second. During these 30 million years, each of them had been constantly experiencing Luo Fan's worldview in other space-time dimensions, which stimulated their own worldview, causing it to continuously grow. Because there were so many worldviews that they could compare and comprehend at all times, the growth of their worldviews was unimaginably fast during this process. Over the past 30 million years, the space-time transformed from Luo Fan's origin of life had grown tremendously. Each and every one of them had become much more perfect and vast. Moreover, this allowed them to obtain even more comprehension and gain even greater gains. In turn, it allowed their worldview to grow once more. Just like that, it formed an extremely positive cycle. During these 30 million years, occasionally, Luo Fan from other space-time dimensions would sense the uniqueness of this space-time dimension. He would adjust his own space-time dimension and step into this space-time dimension, joining in the display of this worldview. However, compared to before, it was still much lesser. In the end, it didn't increase by 1,000. From this aspect, Luo Fan's previous judgment was correct. But it was also correct. Just like that, time continued to pass. When Luo Fan truly felt that the growth of his worldview had reached a certain limit, he had already sensed every worldview in every space-time dimension, and every worldview had stimulated his worldview to the limit. More than 300 million years had passed. On this day, Luo Fan's heart trembled as an indescribable feeling emerged in his heart. After a brief moment of comprehension, his heart became inexplicably complicated. There are still 3,000 years before the second great calamity will descend the current him. His heart was filled with joy, apprehension, and worry. The arrival of the second great calamity was a great opportunity for him. It could even be said that it was the only way for him to reach the end. However, at the same time, based on the first Great Tribulation, the second Great Tribulation would definitely be extremely dangerous and difficult. How could he not be worried? His heart skipped a beat. The time and space that the origin of his life had transformed into, which was also the manifestation of that worldview, slowly faded away. Not long after, it completely disappeared. His figure reappeared in the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. It was directly separated from the process of exchanging worldviews with his other space-time dimensions. As he broke away, each and every Luo Fan seemed to have sensed something and broke away from the communication process one by one. Of course, they were all Luo Fans of different space-time dimensions. Even if there were some similarities in their nature, such as the speed of comprehension and the time taken to comprehend, it was impossible for them to be completely equivalent. In the end, only a small portion of Luo Fan's body reached its limit and broke away from the process. Luo Fan, who had just escaped, looked at each other with smiles on their faces. He did not greet the others and immediately adjusted his own space-time dimension. His figure gradually became blurry and disappeared from this space-time dimension in the blink of an eye. Seeing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and also adjusted his own space-time dimension. His figure gradually disappeared from this space-time dimension. He reappeared in the misty space. After arriving here, he did not continue to stay here. After choosing the right direction, he directly flew away. Not long after, he left this misty space and appeared outside that space-time dimension. When he appeared there, he turned around and saw that there were suddenly countless figures among them. Countless figures of Luo Fan. Looking at their appearances, Luo Fan could vaguely see many familiar figures. Obviously, Many of them were like Luo Fan, who had broken away from that kind of communication. Luo Fan was already very familiar with these kinds of strange changes, so he naturally had nothing to say at this time. With just a thought, he casually patted the void in front of him. Countless 4 types of basic existences surged out of his hand and began to construct continuously according to all kinds of mysterious rules. Not long after, a space-time that seemed to be formed from his life origin appeared. Among them, the charm that belonged to the world of laws was many times stronger than it had been in the past. Seeing that the space-time had already taken shape, he did not hesitate and directly stepped into it. He arrived at the cave residence that he had set up and stayed there. In another 3,000 years, the second great calamity would arrive, but Space Maiden still had not broken away from that different space-time dimension. This obviously made it impossible for him to leave this place. Therefore, he could only directly open up a cave residence here and prepare to live. The second great calamity would definitely be extremely terrifying, and the impact would definitely be extremely shocking. Moreover, judging from the situation of the world's great calamity, it would obviously be extremely difficult to make any targeted preparations. Perhaps hundreds of millions of methods would be completely useless in the end. If that was the case, it would be better to prepare nothing and just work hard to cultivate, working hard to make himself stronger to face that great calamity. Perhaps that way, there would be a greater possibility of success. After exchanging views with the many different space-time dimensions with Luo Fan's world of rules had become much more perfect than before. However, although the perfection of the world of rules was a foundation, it did not mean that any growth could immediately be transformed into strength. In fact, if he wanted to transform the growth of the world of rules into strength, he still needed a process of comprehension and transformation. This process could be long or short, but it could not be skipped. Now, there were only 3,000 years left before the Great Calamity. Although the time was a little short, it was not impossible if he made the best use of his time. At that moment, Luo Fan closed his eyes and sat in meditation in this cave residence. His mind started to move, and he began to carefully experience the transformation. Although he had stayed in the various space-time dimensions for such a long time, due to the uncertainty of time, at this time, only slightly more than 1,000,000 years had passed since Luo Fan and Space Maiden entered the misty space separately. This amount of time might be unimaginably long in the eyes of ordinary people. But for powerful cultivators, it was only a blink of an eye. After so many years, the project that Qing Longzi, Qiu Daozi, and the others were doing, which was to find and remove the brand left in their luck path world, had already come to an end. For the disciples of a true divine who had powerful magic treasures bestowed by a true divine, there is only something that could not be imagined and nothing that could not be done, as long as they had enough time and patience. It seemed like an impossible task to find an unknown brand in the luck path world and remove it. However, after more than 1,000,000 years of planning, after countless deductions and combinations with the help of their own magic treasures, they finally found what they were looking for at this time. It actually exists in such a way. No wonder it took us so long to find it. At this moment, they formed a light screen in the center with the help of their magic treasures, which shone towards the luck path world that belonged to them. The light screen formed by the magic treasures bestowed by a true divine was not an ordinary light screen. It was not even a light screen that could only reflect the long river of luck path. Instead, it was a light screen that could reflect light and shadow and undergo some mysterious distortion and transformation. Through this light screen, the other special aspects of the luck path world were blurred, and only the brand that belonged to this world that they were looking for was truly revealed. At this moment, they could see through this light screen that there were countless dense lines engraved on the luck path worlds. These lines intertwined and combined into a whole in an incomparably complicated manner, causing the entire luck path world to change. It was vaguely connected with an existence that even the luck path world couldn't reflect. Evidently, the whole formed by the countless lines was the brand that this world had engraved on their luck path world. It's actually a luck path world that completely enveloped us. Looks like we're in trouble. Xiao Daozi sighed. There was extreme hesitation in his eyes. The luck path world was extremely important. If there was even the slightest bit of damage, that they could not predict, they might lose any chance of becoming a true divine. They could not help but be cautious, and they could not help but feel troubled by the current situation. I feel that perhaps reincarnation is an acceptable choice. At this moment, a true divine disciple sighed. Xiao Daozi said, "If you reincarnate, do you think you can get rid of this kind of brand?" Qing Longzi frowned and said. The true divine disciple who said that he wanted to reincarnate looked at the dense lines on his luck path world and could not help but reveal an extremely ugly expression. If he were to reincarnate, he would only be able to renew his own life essence at most with his abilities. As for the luck path world, it was rather powerless. In other words, even if he used the most thorough reincarnation method and endured tens of thousands of years of confusion in the womb, it was still uncertain whether he could renew his luck path world and get rid of the brand. Under such circumstances, how could he possibly make up his mind? There's a way to be sure. At this moment, another true divine disciple spoke. Everyone was stunned and turned to look at the true divine disciple who looked like a young man. There was a hint of eagerness in his eyes. Didn't many senior and junior brothers reincarnate previously? We just need to see the results of their reincarnation. I think that after such a long time, they should have already grown up, the true divine disciple said. His words woke everyone up from their dreams. All their eyes lit up. It was only then that they remembered that it was no longer the time when they started their research. After such a long time, those true divine disciples who went to reincarnate might not have recovered their memories or grown up, but their reincarnation must have been completed. If that was the case, if they wanted to know if reincarnation was effective and if it could completely eliminate or weaken the brand, wouldn't it be fine as long as they went to check on their situation? That's right. This suggestion makes sense. Qing Longzi nodded his head. That's right, Xiao Daozi agreed. At that moment, a relaxed smile appeared on everyone's faces. They were all satisfied with this suggestion. As for how to find the reincarnation bodies of their comrades, however, not a single one of them spoke. Although those fellow Taoists must have made preparations for their reincarnations, they must have all sorts of methods to conceal themselves so that they wouldn't be found by others. However, among them, there were definitely people they were familiar with. With such familiarity as a guide, it would obviously not be too difficult to find the reincarnation bodies of the people they were familiar with. At most, it would be troublesome. Since they had already made a decision at this moment, there was no need for them to say anything more. They immediately kept their treasures and let the light screen that shone out of the luck path gradually fade away. In the blink of an eye, it had completely disappeared. Immediately after, everyone agreed on how to contact each other. Then, one by one, they left this space-time and went to different places in this world. After they had left, the space-time that they had constructed with the help of the formation, which contained an unknown number of living beings, suddenly trembled and completely collapsed. Even the living beings within the formation had completely disappeared, turning into nothingness. 3 years later, in another place in this world, the few of them gathered once again. However, there was already one or several cultivators following them. These cultivators were all extremely shocked and looked at them with great caution. Some of them were strong, while some were weak. The strongest among them was probably at the demi-saint level. The weakest, they had not even reached the Khanate Grand Luo. Judging from their expressions toward Xiao Daozi and the others, it was obvious that they had not recovered their memories. When Qing Longzi saw the others, he said 58 times, 87 times, 109 times, 92 times. When the others heard that, they all opened their mouths and said the same number. I don't think there's a need to look at it, Azure Dragon said. Qing Longzi sighed and said to the others. The numbers they mentioned were none other than the number of reincarnations of their comrades that they had brought with them. In other words, the number of deaths. In millions of years, they had actually died so many times. Even an ordinary cultivator would not be this unlucky. The disciples of a true sage had actually died so many times and reincarnated so many times. How could this be possible if the world did not do something to them? Even an ordinary person would be able to figure this out with just a little thought, let alone the disciples of Qing Longzi and the others who were at the rank 9 pseudo-sage realm. We have to look at it eventually. Perhaps it's just that their reincarnation method was wrong that led to this result. One of the disciples of a true sage said, "What are you guys talking about? I am me. I'm not anyone's reincarnation." At this moment, the demi-saint beside Qiu Daozi said coldly. At this moment, the other cultivators that Qing Longzi and the others had brought with them all nodded in agreement with solemn expressions. Any cultivator who could cultivate to a high level would have an extremely independent mind. They would never think that all of their achievements were just the legacy of their past lives. Therefore, when any cultivator heard others say that they were the reincarnations of so-and-so, they would not feel proud or proud. Instead, they would feel a sense of humiliation. What does that mean? I'm the reincarnation of so-and-so to have such achievements. Then all my years of hard work have gone to waste. I've suffered so much and endured so much loneliness for so many years, and it's all for nothing. Hearing this, Qiu Daozi only shook his head and sighed. He did not answer him. Now, these people had completely lost their memories of the past. They were completely different people and could no longer be considered as their peers. Since they were not peers, how could they have any intention of explaining to such weak existences? Then let's take a look. We can also try to see if there's a way to recover their memories. Qing Longzi sighed as well. This attitude of not taking them seriously infuriated the cultivators that they had brought with them. At this moment, all of them were enraged. Their energy surged. Even if they were no match for them, they would attack the people around them. However, the strongest among them was only a demi-saint, and the weakest among them was not even a Khanate Grand Luo. How could they resist Qing Longzi and the others? They didn't even need to take any action. Just a glance from them was enough to completely destroy all of their methods of retaliation, causing them to seem like statues. At this moment, because they were worried, they did not have the mood to build a formation to serve as a cave abode. At that moment, he placed a few reincarnators in the center, but he himself spread out in all directions, surrounding them and summoning his own transcendent artifacts. Just like before, he activated the power of his transcendent artifacts, forming an increasingly obvious screen of light above everyone's heads. When they used their Dharma treasures, they felt an indescribable pressure pressing down on their hearts. Chapter 1807. This cautiousness was the reason why they did not use their techniques in the cave abode that they had built themselves. If they were in the cave abode, as everything was built by themselves, no matter what techniques they used, as long as they did not directly target heaven and earth, they would have almost no impact on heaven and earth. In that case, they would naturally be able to use more techniques, and they would not have to worry too much about heaven and earth affecting them to eliminate their power. However, it was different in the open. Here, everything in the surroundings, including every blade of grass and tree, was a part of heaven and earth. Judging from the limitations of heaven and earth, any power that they used would naturally affect something in the surroundings and cause some damage. Even if they were not targeting heaven and earth, they could not change the situation. Therefore, if they were to use their techniques in the open, they would naturally cause heaven and earth to interfere with them if they were not careful. The dark clouds that had gathered in the sky just now were born because of this. Fortunately, they were all disciples of the true sage sect, and their control of their own power had reached the acme of perfection. There was almost no leakage, and they tried their best to reduce the impact on the outside world. That was why heaven and earth did not interfere with them. However, to Qiu Daozi and the rest, these were all secondary. At that very moment, through the adjustment of the light screen, and with the help of the aura and essence of the cultivators in front of them, they finally locked onto the Luck Dao world that belonged to them in the river of Luck Dao. As soon as they saw the Luck Dao world, their faces became extremely ugly. In their eyes, compared to their own Luck Dao world, the Luck Dao world that belonged to heaven and earth had changed a little, but it still existed. Moreover, it was still extremely clear, extremely stubborn. If there was anything different, it would be that there was an additional layer of strange seal on top of the Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world. That layer of seal was extremely mysterious. It seemed to be of the same origin as the Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world, but there were some differences. On the new layer of seal, the sensitivity of the Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world had weakened a little. In the end, its reaction was no longer as fast as the Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world. So this is the method to cultivate to this level. No wonder we are so unlucky. Xiao Daozi could not help but sigh when he saw this scene. The Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world's Luck Dao world had yet to disappear. This meant that they were still being locked onto by heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, any damage they caused to this world would be recorded by the world. Once it exceeded a certain level, it would erupt and produce all kinds of effects on them. This was obviously a hand that was raised high and could fall down at any time. If one was not careful, or if one made a mistake, it would suddenly fall. Directly wipe them out. That was why they were reincarnated again and again, falling into depravity again and again, it seems. The reincarnation technique won't work, Azure Dragon's son said with a sigh. Indeed, if we were to reincarnate, we would also be reduced to their level. At that time, he would die again and again and be reborn again and again. In the end, he would be completely assimilated by this heaven and earth. All his memories would disappear, and he would become a part of this heaven and earth. A true divine disciple said. Hearing this, everyone's faces turned extremely ugly. Assimilated by the world. Become a part of this world? How could they accept this? Not to mention that they were from the true sage sect. Even if they were just ordinary cultivators, they would not be able to survive. They would not be willing to accept such a result. Then what should we do now? A true divine disciple said. As they spoke, each of them had already retrieved the magic treasures above their heads. As the treasures were retrieved, the light screen completely collapsed and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the cultivators who were surrounded by them in the center all looked a little frightened. Although they had already lost their memories after reincarnation, their essence was not completely distorted. They could still sense how terrible the situation was for them from the light screen just now. At this moment, all of them actually started to believe what the crowd had said. Are we just going to hide like this? Another true divine disciple said with a frown. It's obviously impossible to hide like this. Maybe we can ask for some authority from this heaven and earth and create some karma to dilute or even neutralize this imprint. Azure Dragon's son's eyes shone with a light of contemplation, asking for some authority from the heaven and earth. If this was in the past, it would naturally be a small matter. However, do you think it's possible now? Xiao Daozi sighed. This was actually very obvious. Right now, they were equivalent to the prisoners of this world. If a prisoner wanted to ask for some authority from the person who imprisoned them, would it be possible for them to build this prison if they gave them the authority? It's indeed almost impossible for us to obtain this bit of authority ourselves. However, there's someone who can help us, Azure Dragon said. What you're saying, could it be? Everyone frowned. At the same time, the figure of a calm-looking young man appeared in their minds. Only he can do it. He's the creator of this world. As long as he asks, as long as he agrees, let's not talk about just obtaining some authority. Even if we want to completely remove this imprint, it'll be a very simple matter, Azure Dragon said. At this moment, everyone was silent. The person they were talking about was naturally Luo Fan. However, thinking about how they schemed against Luo Fan previously and recalling the scene when they besieged Luo Fan, they still did not believe that Luo Fan would help them again. Not to mention Luo Fan. Even if it was them, it was already very unbelievable that he did not participate in such a matter and deal with them later. Senior Qiu Daozi, you've dealt with him previously. Do you think it's possible? Azure Dragon asked. I've dealt with him before. Haven't you guys dealt with him before too? Qiu Daozi said calmly. To him, Luo Fan was almost his humiliation. Others had only failed in his hands once, but he had failed several times. At this moment, when he thought of Luo Fan, he felt uncomfortable all over. His whole body was uncomfortable, and there was a strong anger in his heart. If it wasn't for the fact that he was a disciple of a true saint and had a firm heart, he was even ready to risk his life to fight him with no regard for his own safety. We said that we won't touch him. However, there's someone who might be able to persuade him, a disciple of a true saint said. Hearing this, Chodaozi, Azure Dragon, and the rest's eyes lit up as they thought of something. However, the light in their eyes quickly dimmed. The person who might be able to persuade Luo Fan was, of course, the battle god's son whom he had quite a good relationship with. However, although the battle god's son had a good relationship with him, the betrayal of this relationship was even more infuriating. They could imagine how Luo Fan felt about the battle god's son at this moment. However, it was hard for them to have any hope. Although the possibility is not high, it's still higher than us. However, the possibility is still higher than us, the disciple of the true sage said again at this moment. Everyone had to agree with this. After all, friendship was friendship. Even if there was betrayal, it was still friendship. Having a friendship was, of course, much better than not having a friendship. This was not hard to understand. The establishment of a friendship was because both parties were like-minded. It was because both parties saw each other's strengths and saw that they were compatible with each other. If such a friendship was betrayed, it would cause great anger. It would cause the person who was betrayed to turn the friendship into anger or even hatred. However, the basic friendship would not completely disappear as long as it was under certain conditions. Under special circumstances, it wasn't difficult to turn this anger and hatred around once again. If it was not so, there would not be such an earth-shattering quarrel between the couple. They could not wait for the other party to die immediately. After a few days, they would be as sweet as honey again. Friend, do you have a way to contact Junior Brother Battle God's son? Chodaozi asked as a last resort. It's not too difficult to contact him. If he can't enter such a mysterious place, there's naturally no other way. Once there's a way to enter, do you think he would be willing to give up so easily? The disciple of a true saint smiled. Hearing this, everyone's eyes lit up. Although there were no specific details, just this thought alone was enough to enlighten them. Back then, the battle god's son had split up many projections to contact everyone. Although during that battle, all of his projections seemed to have disappeared. But could it be that those were all of his projections? They put themselves in his shoes. If they were the battle god's son and discovered that this place was superior to the main world in some aspects, would they really not leave some projections to walk around and comprehend? It must be so. Looks like there's no such thing as a dead end. A joyous expression appeared on Qing Longzi's face. Since they had already confirmed that the battle god's son was most likely in this world, it was naturally a simple matter for them to contact the battle god's son. Immediately, they dispersed the restrictions on the people in the center. With a wave of their hands, they had already directly sent them hundreds of millions of light years away. Although this process wasn't directed at this world and didn't intend to destroy anything in this world, the eruption of energy had still affected the surrounding space, causing dark clouds to gather in the sky, and vaguely felt an indescribable pressure pressing down on their hearts. In the end, we still have to build a cave abode. Otherwise, we won't even be able to contact Junior Brother Battle God, Chodaozi said with an ugly expression as he looked at the dark clouds above his head. Everyone was silent. After a long while, they sighed and took out the various materials and powers that they had created in their bodies. They started to continuously combine and build. Not long after, they had already built a huge formation, forming a space-time that could be used as their cave abode. During this process, they were also trembling with fear. Although this kind of action would not cause any damage to this world and would not trigger the restrictions of this world. However, this was only in theory. In reality, if they were not careful and made a mistake, this world would not be polite to them. At that time, that kind of blow would probably make their efforts go to waste. After building the cave abode with great difficulty, they quickly stepped into the cave abode and heaved a sigh of relief. We can finally use some power. This thought appeared in their minds at the same time. After having this thought, their expressions became extremely ugly. As the disciples of a rank 9 false saint, true saint, they had always been high and mighty. Even those false saints, even those supreme emperors had to be respectful when facing them. Now, they were already happy and excited to be able to use some time power. This difference, to them, it went without saying how humiliating it was. At this time, they no longer had the mood to decorate the cave abode. They were in the cave abode. They randomly picked a place and began to use various methods to contact the projection of the battle god sun that might exist in this world. As for their methods, they were naturally different. Everyone had their own characteristics. However, it was obvious that the battle god sun did not have a pleasant relationship with them. At this time, even if he received their request to contact him, it was unlikely that he would respond to them immediately. Moreover, they did not know where the battle god sun was. Therefore, they spent more than 10 years of continuous hard work before finally getting a response at a certain moment. Are you guys done? It's been more than 10 years. Are you still going to let us have peace? An angry roar came across the sky and reverberated in the cave abode. It even shook the entire space-time to the point that it almost collapsed and was destroyed. From this, it could be seen how angry the person who spoke was. Hearing this angry roar, there was no shame on everyone's face. Instead, everyone was pleasantly surprised. The person who spoke was, of course, the battle god's son. His response also represented one thing, and that was that they had guessed correctly. The battle god's son really did not give up on this world. Although it seemed that he had suffered a huge loss back then, there was still a projection in this world. Junior brother battle god, we have no other choice but to resort to this method. I hope that junior brother will forgive us. Xiao Daozi sighed at this moment. At this moment, the void distorted and a figure condensed in the void. It was the appearance of the battle god's son. However, compared to before, the battle god's son's current appearance was extremely ordinary. It was as if he was an ordinary person that could exist anywhere in this world. However, it was impossible to see his original appearance. So what? This is your own fault. What does it have to do with me? Why do you have to transfer your depression to me? The battle god's son said without giving any face. Junior brother battle god, you can't say that. Qing Longzi frowned. The battle god's son frowned. At this moment, they were the ones asking for his help. What was with his attitude? At this moment, Xiao Daozi and the others were secretly anxious. They were secretly worried that Qing Longzi would say something irrevocable. We stepped into this world together. We are originally of the same breath and branch. Who knows what happened to us today won't happen to you tomorrow. Do you really think that your betrayal is over just like that? Qing Longzi said. Her words were not without reason. After all, it was a fact that the battle god's son had betrayed Luo Fan. At this moment, the battle god's son did not suffer any setbacks. He could still live freely in this world and cultivate freely. This was because he had avoided it cleverly. However, it was more likely because Luo Fan had his own things to do and simply did not have the time to care about him. Under such circumstances, who knew whether or not Luo Fan would take the time and spare the time to deal with him? At that time, their present would naturally be the battle god's son's tomorrow. Since you all know that I also betrayed him and will end up like you in the future, why do you still ask for my help? The battle god's son said calmly. It is true that we need your help to get through this. However, this is also an opportunity for you, right? Qing Longzi said calmly. He hasn't attacked you yet because he still cares about our friendship. This is also the time to make up for it. If we wait until he attacks you in the future, then all our friendship will be irreparable. If you all help us, it may seem a little difficult, but it is an excellent opportunity to mend the cracks. Hearing this, the battle god's son only smiled faintly and said, Do you think that my understanding of him is worse than yours? Everyone was stunned by his words. He is a person who does not beat around the bush. Even if he has any plans, he is straightforward and will not do one thing in front of others and another behind their backs. At that time, he did not attack me. This means that from now on, he will not attack me. The battle god's son said calmly. Hearing this, everyone's hearts sank. Perhaps he just did not discover you at that time. Qing Longzi said. Did not discover me? The battle god's son only smiled coldly and said, do you all think that you are stronger than him? Do you think that he would not discover something that you all could discover? In the past, if anyone said that someone was stronger than them, unless that person was a true sage, Qing Longzi and the others would definitely jump up to refute and would definitely not admit it. However, after entering this world, after experiencing so many setbacks, after experiencing so many near-death experiences, this mentality finally completely disappeared. They couldn't help but admit that Luo Fan was stronger than them, regardless of which aspect. Therefore, senior brothers and senior sisters, please do not bother me anymore. I am very sympathetic to your experience, but there is really nothing I can do, the battle god's son said calmly. Chapter 1808. Wait! At this moment, Qiu Daozi shouted. To view the latest chapters of this book, please visit 800book.net, www.800book.net. These words could not stop the battle god's son. He was still gradually disappearing. It was obvious that he did not want to bother with him anymore. At this moment, Qiu Daozi took out an item and said, if Junior Brother Battle God is willing to help, I can give this to you. The battle god's son's body froze. His body that was gradually fading away gradually became clear and reappeared. Then, he turned around and looked at the item that had appeared in Qiu Daozi's hand. That was a ball of light that looked extremely illusory. This ball of light faintly revealed an extremely mysterious charm. It was as if there was an unknown amount of time and space within it. How many worlds and how many mysteries were contained within it? This is the connate seed of the world. The battle god's son looked at the ball of light, and his face revealed an inexplicable expression as he mumbled. That's right. This is the connate seed of the world that was found in the seed of chaos. Qiu Daozi sighed and said, this is the connate seed of the world. If it grows, it can even grow into a world like the main world. Are you really willing to give it to me? The battle god's son frowned and said, if you're willing to help, I will give it to you. Qiu Daozi clenched his teeth and said, to be able to grow into a perfect world, it was not a connate seed of the world that was created by an ordinary cultivator. It went without saying how precious it was. It could be said that if it could be cultivated, it could even grow into a world that was countless times more precious than any connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. However, this was only under the situation where it could be cultivated completely. Such a connate seed of the world had already become broken after being corroded by the chaotic state. Although it was not to the extent that it could not be used completely to cultivate it, it would take a lot of time and effort. It was enough to make the true divine disciples feel hopeless. Because of this, they did not think that it could be compared to the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. However, it was obvious that even if it could not be compared to the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, its value had reached an unimaginable level. Using it to exchange for the battle god's son's help, that could almost be called using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The battle god's son stood there, his expression fluctuating. He wanted to ignore it, but he couldn't bear to part with the innate world seed. He wanted to agree, but he did not have the confidence to face Luo Fan, this kind of hesitation. It was extremely rare for it to appear in the disciples of a true sage who was already at the 9th stage pseudo-sage. At this moment, Qing Longzi and the others were also nervous. They stared at the battle god's son in midair, wanting to see what kind of decision he would make. After a while, the battle god's son let out a long sigh and said, the temptation of the innate world seed is too great. In the end, I still can't bear to part with it. Hearing this, everyone's faces lit up. Qiu Daozi felt a little heartache amidst his joy. This innate world seed was the kind of seed that was born naturally in a state of chaos, without any creator. Even though he was a disciple of a true saint, he had only received one when his master was in a good mood. How could he not feel heartache? All right, I can talk to him on your behalf. However, Regardless of whether he agrees or not, this innate world seed will be mine, the battle god sun said. Chiodaozi said, of course. As he spoke, although he was extremely reluctant to part with it, he still sent the ball of light in his hand. It passed through time and space and appeared in the battle god sun's hand. 800. The battle god sun grabbed the innate world seed with one hand. His face was filled with joy and distress. Can you guys find where he is? He sighed. He asked. This made Chiodaozi and the others look at each other. They had discussed for so long, but they had not thought of the most important problem. Where was Luo Fan? It seems that you guys still can't find him. The battle god sun looked as if he had expected it. At this moment, he took out an item and said, here is a little aura primer. You guys might be able to use this primer to trigger his senses and let his doppelganger come here. Hearing this, everyone's faces changed. They had already developed a fear of Luo Fan. In fact, if it wasn't so, they wouldn't have put so much hope on Luo Fan and thought that he could help them get through this difficult situation. Now that they heard that they had to actively attract Luo Fan's attention instead of looking for him, they were all a little worried. Don't worry. He will make a move the moment he senses you guys. As long as I am here, he will give us some chances to talk. The battle god sun knew what they were thinking and said. Now that they had come this far, they naturally couldn't retreat anymore. Everyone gritted their teeth, and Azure Dragon Master made a grabbing motion. The battle god sun took out the wisp of aura and grabbed it in front of him. After that, she nodded at the others and began to exert force one by one. Waves of energy were injected into the aura through an indescribable change. It began to have an indescribable effect on the aura, making the aura more and more obvious and more intense. At this moment, in a place that couldn't be described with words, in the cave, dwelling in front of the misty space, Luo Fan, who was cultivating, felt something moving in his heart. With a slight calculation, he already knew where this feeling came from. His face couldn't help but change slightly. I've already ignored you guys. You guys still dare to come? Immediately, with a thought, a clone walked out of his body. It directly distorted space and stepped into it. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared from this space. When it appeared again, it had already passed through countless layers of space and traveled an unknown distance. It appeared in the formation that Chiodaozi and the others had created together. It was also at this moment that he sensed the battle god sun's existence. For a moment, there was no expression on his face. He just calmly walked in and appeared in the cave dwelling. I didn't think that you would actually appear in front of me. Do I look like the kind of person who doesn't have a temper? Luo Fan lightly said as he looked at the battle god's son. What kind of person was he? At this moment, he could tell who was looking for him with a single glance. He could even vaguely guess why he was looking for him. Of course not. The battle god's son's face revealed a look of shame. This time, I came to apologize to you. Apologize? Fine. I accept, Luo Fan lightly said. As he spoke, he turned around and was about to leave. Seeing him like this, the battle god's son hurriedly said, why do you have to do this? We are all cultivators. Isn't it normal to occasionally have conflicts? Why do you have to act like we are enemies now? Luo Fan faintly smiled and said, indeed, it's normal to have conflicts. There are also many people who become friends after that. However, that's just a normal response. Don't tell me you think that I didn't attack you after that. Is that a normal response? Hearing this, the battle god's son chuckled and said, of course I know what you mean. You're using this method to completely cut off our friendship. Of course I understand. Since you understand, why don't you hide to the side and cultivate? Why do you dare to appear in front of me? Luo Fan lightly said. In reality, just as the battle god's son and the others thought, he knew very well that the battle god's son was still in this world and hadn't left. He just didn't care what he thought in his heart. It was precisely to use this method to completely cut off any friendship in the past. From then on, he treated the lone cultivator as a complete stranger. If this kind of thing was done by an ordinary person, it was naturally just being stubborn and deceiving himself. However, as a cultivator, as a powerful existence who completely controlled his own mind and emotions. Once this kind of thing was done, it was truly cutting off all friendship. This was also the reason why Luo Fan was still able to calmly communicate with the battle god's son ever since they met. Although I want to avoid them, they have a very deep friendship with me. But they have a deep relationship with me. If I ignore them, I will not be able to explain it to the sect. Do Shenzi laughed. At this moment, he had already seen through Luo Fan's thoughts. However, he didn't dare to mention anything about friendship anymore. In reality, he was a little regretful. He regretted getting involved in this matter. Even though the innate seed of the world was precious, it couldn't compare to his own cultivation. If he were to fall out with Luo Fan now, his real body wouldn't be too damaged in this world. However, all of his projections would definitely be chased out. At that time, this perfect cultivation environment would have nothing to do with him anymore. And then, Luo Fan lightly said, "They want you to help them get rid of the brand of the world. Do you have a way?" The battle god's son asked. "Of course I have a way. However, what does that have to do with you?" Luo Fan lightly said. Hearing this, the eyes of Chiu Daozi and the others brightened. Then, they felt inexplicably distressed. Luo Fan had made it clear that he indeed had a way, but he just wouldn't help them. Suddenly, Luo Fan frowned. With a thought, he made a grabbing motion. In an instant, the battle god's son's body trembled slightly. The Azure Dragon's son and the others also trembled slightly. Then, wisps of aura leaked out from their bodies. He raised his hand and caught them in his hand. This aura wasn't their aura, but Luo Fan's own aura. So much of my aura has been collected. Looks like I have to clean up this world. Luo Fan frowned as he looked at the mass of aura. At this moment, the expressions of the battle god's son and the others changed slightly. They clearly didn't expect Luo Fan's senses to be so sharp. The aura wasn't directly collected from his body. Instead, it was collected from the traces that Luo Fan occasionally left behind in this world. It could be said that the battle god's son, Chiu Daozi, and the others had traveled to countless areas to collect these auras. Before this, they had used countless methods to conceal and conceal it. Normally, even if Luo Fan were to search for them wholeheartedly, he wouldn't be able to find these auras. However, at this moment, facing them, Luo Fan gently waved his hand, and these auras were all in his hands. In contrast, the battle god's son was not only shocked by Luo Fan's methods, but he also felt an inexplicable anger. Chiu Daozi and the others obviously had Luo Fan's aura, but they actually wanted him to release this aura. This was simply treating him like a fool. Even if he was an ordinary person, he would be unhappy, let alone a disciple of a true divine. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't have the mood to care about them. His heart moved slightly, and he released his senses. In an instant, it swept through the entire world, and he could see through every area of this world. The countless traces that he had left in this world instantly appeared in his mind. Sensing these traces, his eyes revealed an inexplicable nostalgia. These traces were almost all left by him and the sky made them together. The existence of every trace represented a bit of his memory. At this moment, as he sensed these traces, all kinds of feelings suddenly appeared in his heart. After a long time, he sighed. He dispersed his senses. In the end, he didn't clean up all the traces. Moreover, with a shake of his hand, the auras that appeared in everyone's hands naturally disintegrated and floated to every corner of the world. In the blink of an eye, they had already crossed a distance of billions of light years and returned to the place where they had been collected in the beginning. They once again integrated into the world and disappeared. Seeing Luo Fan's action, Chiu Daozi and the others all revealed a look of surprise. Obviously, they didn't understand his action. However, Luo Fan didn't intend to explain to them. He said, "If you want me to help them, I can. I can. What price can you pay?" To him, at this moment, the many disciples of a true divine had become ordinary passers-by. Seeing them in trouble, he didn't have the same feeling of satisfaction as before. Under such circumstances, to him, whether to help them or not was already a matter of mood. Under such circumstances, If the other party's price was right, he wouldn't refuse to help. Of course, this was only under the circumstances where the price was right. Hearing this, the eyes of Qing Longzi and the others lit up. Although they still had to pay a price, being able to ask this, that meant that the other party didn't reject helping them. At this moment, the battle godson smiled and said, I think they should be able to pay a price that will satisfy you. After all, they are the disciples of a sage. With that, he stood at the side with his hands folded. It was as though this matter had nothing to do with him at all. Although Qiu Daozi and the others were displeased, they understood in the end that it was only natural for them to behave in such a manner after the previous discovery. Thus, they could only forcefully swallow the displeasure in their hearts. They turned to face Luo Fan. This time, it wasn't Qiu Daozi who spoke. Qing Longzi raised his hand and took out something. He said, I'm willing to use this as the price. Luo Fan looked over with rapt attention, and a mass of qi appeared in his hand. This ball of air was extremely strange. It was dusky and constantly flowed in his hand, constantly changing its shape. At every moment, there seemed to be hundreds of millions of mysteries. Hundreds of millions of worlds were born and destroyed within it. There were also endless principles and mysteries being born and destroyed within it. There's the will of chaos within it. Could it be that this is the product of the fusion of chaos and the will of the world? Luo Fan looked at the item and said in a low voice. Even though they were in opposing camps, Qing Longzi couldn't help but feel impressed. This item was also a treasure given to her by her master. Back then, if her master hadn't said anything, she wouldn't have known how it was formed no matter how long she studied it. However, Luo Fan was only a lone cultivator, yet he was able to see through the essence of this item at a glance. This kind of insight made her feel ashamed. Of course, although she was impressed, she was not willing to say it out loud because of her camp. Therefore, she only said, That's right. This is an item formed by the fusion of the will of the world and chaos. Not only can this item comprehend the true meaning of the will of the world, but it can also comprehend the mysteries of chaos. It's a peerless treasure that's not much weaker than the connate, inextinguishable spiritual aura. As long as you can remove our world imprint, I'll give this item to you. When Luo Fan heard that this was indeed the product of the fusion of the will of the world and the state of chaos, he couldn't help but feel very interested. Both of them were existences that he couldn't completely understand at the moment. If he could obtain it, it would be extremely beneficial for him to understand those two existences. Sure. At that moment, he nodded and said, However, this item can at most allow 4 of you to escape. It won't be enough for the 7 of you to escape completely. Hearing this, Qing Longzi's expression relaxed and said, For then. As he spoke, he sent the ball of air current in his hand over to Luo Fan. To Qing Longzi, she was already satisfied that she could escape. Now that the other 3 were included, it was already a pleasant surprise. What was there to be dissatisfied about? As for the other 3, they would have to discuss it themselves. She would go and trade with Luo Fan. After all, she wasn't their mother. At this moment, the expressions of the others changed. As they looked at each other, one of the disciples of a true sage took out an item and said, I'm willing to use this item to exchange for the other 3's escape. This item was a piece of, or that had an irregular shape. After it appeared in his hand, it naturally distorted the surrounding time and space. It distorted the laws of the surroundings, and vaguely, it seemed like it was about to form its own time and space. It had the taste of heaven and earth, a material from the state of chaos. Seeing this item, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. Chapter 1809. He raised his hand and waved. In an instant, the piece of, or had already crossed time and space, and landed in his hand. As soon as the ore touched his hand, he knew that his feeling was correct. This ore really came from the state of chaos. Within the ore, there were countless mysteries and characteristics that could only be found in the state of chaos. If such an existence did not come from a state of chaos, he could not imagine where it came from. An ore that came from a state of chaos definitely contained countless mysteries. If it could be used, its power would not be much weaker than the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Such an existence was enough for Luo Fan to ignore the enmity between him and Xiao Daozi and the others. Immediately, he put the ore, along with the product of the world's will and the state of chaos, into his sleeve universe. Then, he said, "The deal is done. Let's begin." As he spoke, his heart moved. In his eyes, the river of luck had already appeared before him. At this moment, Xiao Daozi and the others all had indescribably complicated expressions. Some were relieved, some were helpless, and some were heartbroken. However, in the end, most of them were relieved. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart moved. He casually pointed at Xiao Daozi and the others. In an instant, an indescribable fluctuation was emitted from their bodies. This fluctuation was so obscure and mysterious. After it appeared, it naturally formed an inexplicable connection with a world of Luck Dao and the river of Luck Dao. As this connection was established, the world of luck started to tremble slightly. The imprints that belonged to the world that existed on the world started to shine one by one. They were like dots of starlight on the river of luck. This imprint was extremely mysterious and complicated. If Luo Fan was only an ordinary level 3 Supreme Emperor born in this world, he would only be as helpless as Xiao Daozi, Qing Longzi, and the others in the face of this imprint. However, it was obvious. Luo Fuan was not an ordinary level 3 Supreme Emperor. As the creator of this world, he had a deep understanding of this world. Almost no other living being could compare to him. In his eyes, this kind of imprint wasn't as untraceable as other living beings. However, he could see how many layers the imprint was divided into. He could also see where the core of the imprint was hidden beneath the countless layers. Under such circumstances, it was obviously not as difficult as he had imagined for him to find a way to disintegrate this brand. With a thought, an unknown number of living beings stepped out of his own world of luck. These living beings, although they were only at the pseudo-sage level, the power they could unleash when they worked together was earth-shattering. After they left the Luck Path world, Pina crossed the endless void in the blink of an eye and appeared around the Luck Path world of Xiao Daozi and the others. Like an ant, she attached herself to the brand above the Luck Path world and began to shuttle through the layers of barriers of the brand as she gradually approached the core of the brand. Such a process was naturally seen by Xiao Daozi and the others. For a moment, they once again felt that Luo Fan was unfathomable. They could only vaguely sense of things about the world of luck. The manipulation of the living beings within. That was almost impossible to do. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's ability to manipulate the living beings to step out of the world of luck and head to another world of luck to deal with mysterious matters simply overturned their worldview. It made them wonder if they were dreaming. Under Luo Fan's control, the living beings in the world of luck kept attacking the imprint, causing it to disintegrate bit by bit. At the same time, they also approached the core of the imprint and arrived at the crucial part of the core. Found it. At a certain moment, Luo Fan had this thought. At the same time, the imprint on Xiao Daozi and the others' world of luck started buzzing and vibrating. Then, an extremely intense light burst out from the imprint and spread in all directions. It spread out in all directions, and in the blink of an eye, it had already smashed the imprints into pieces. Countless threads and lines quickly collapsed in all directions and turned into specks of light that left the world of luck. The light in front of everyone seemed to have become much brighter. An indescribable sense of relaxation appeared in the hearts of the disciples of the true sages at this moment. Finally, we're free. This thought appeared in their minds at the same time. An indescribable joy caused their expressions to brighten up. At this moment, the imprint on their world of luck had completely disappeared. Only the countless living beings were still attached to the world of luck. When Luo Fan saw this scene, his heart trembled slightly. The countless living beings escaped one by one and disappeared from the surface of the world of luck in the blink of an eye. All of them returned to their own world of luck. After all the living beings returned to the world of luck, Luo Fan casually waved his hand, and the river of luck disappeared once again. After that, he said, "The transaction is complete. I welcome everyone to come and trade again next time." As he spoke, his figure flashed, and he was already out of this world. With another flash, he had already disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared in the first place. Obviously, he used this method to return to his original body. During the entire process, he did not look at Battle Godson at all and was too lazy to wait for any reply from the others. To him, this time around, it was completely because of the transaction. If it wasn't for the price, he would definitely not help them. Although his hatred towards the disciples of the true sages in front of him had gradually diminished, he still did not have a good impression of them. Why would he waste time talking to them? At this moment, everyone seemed to have woken up from a dream, and they all had a bitter smile on their faces. This time, our transaction is considered complete. I hope that everyone will not come to me for help next time. If there's a next time, I can't even protect myself, Battle Godson said to Qing Longzi and the others. When Qing Longzi and the others heard this, they stood up and bowed to Battle Godson. They thanked him profusely. To them, although Battle Godson's attitude was not very friendly, he had still helped them build a bridge. They still acknowledged his kindness. "If that's the case, I'll take my leave," Battle Godson nodded at everyone and said. Then, his figure flashed and disappeared without a trace. He had returned to his original place to continue his cultivation. At that moment, in the space-time created by Qing Longzi and the others, there were only a few of them left. Then, they naturally exchanged benefits. After all, the people who had paid the price were Qing Longzi, Qiu Daozi, and one of the disciples of the true sages. The remaining 4 people did not pay at all. At this moment, the 4 of them naturally had to pay a price to make up for Qing Longzi and the other 2. However, this had nothing to do with Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan had already returned to the cave dwelling. It was a ball of light that was the fusion of the will of heaven and earth and the chaotic state. The piece of, or that came from the chaotic state, was quietly placed in front of him, floating in the void. These 2 treasures, compared to any other path of the true sage or chaotic spiritual treasures, they were more useful to him. The path of the true sage was a huge burden to him. Even if he obtained it, it would not be of much use to him. Although the primordial origin spiritual treasure was precious, it was similar to the Tao of a true sage. Although the various mysteries seemed precious and immeasurable, they contained incredible principles and mysteries. But more than that, it was still a burden to him. He still felt overwhelmed. Even if he comprehended some of them, he had to forcefully destroy them. In contrast, the 2 treasures in front of him were different. Needless to say, these 2 ores were naturally formed from the chaotic state of morality ores. They contained countless principles of the chaotic state and were of great use to improving and perfecting his worldview. Moreover, because there was no true sage involved in them, they didn't contain any mysteries of the true sage level, so he didn't feel any burden at all. As for the ball of light formed from the fusion of the will of heaven and earth and the chaotic state, although a true sage might have taken action to fuse the 2, it was only 2. There were no mysteries of the true sage level in it, but it did not bring him any burden. For Luo Fan, who was about to face his second great tribulation in more than 2,000 years, these 2 things were naturally like timely rain. With a thought, Luo Fan wrapped his perception around the 2 treasures in front of him. The moment these 2 treasures came into contact with his perception, they underwent changes. Countless terrifying forces were released from the 2 treasures, constantly impacting his perception and power. Fortunately, he had already gone through a great tribulation, so he was slightly able to endure the primal chaos state. Although such an impact was terrifying, if an ordinary level 3 Supreme Emperor encountered it, it would be almost impossible for them to continue existing, let alone sense the principles and mysteries within. But to him, it only brought him quite a bit of pressure, and he could still continue to sense the principles and profundities within. In the blink of an eye, countless indescribable lights and shadows poured into his mind through his senses. These countless lights and shadows could not be described with words at all. It could be said to be a world, but there were also many scenes that could only appear in a world. It could not be said to be a world, but there were also countless lights and shadows that could only exist in a world. Living beings, time, space, matter, energy, and so on. Everything existed in such a way. Looking at these countless lights and shadows, Luo Fan's life source, which was also the manifestation of the world of laws, began to tremble slightly. Almost all the time, he felt an inexplicable vibration transmitted from these lights and shadows, causing many places in his world of laws, which were originally extremely stable, to loosen up. It also caused many places that were originally extremely unstable to seem to grow roots for a moment. He was completely immersed in it, gradually forgetting all the changes in the outside world. Time passed, and when Luo Fan came back to his senses again, he could already feel that he had arrived at an incomparably strange world. What is this place? He frowned slightly, and countless thoughts flashed through his mind. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed, and a look of horror appeared on his face. This is the second great calamity. The moment this thought flashed through his mind, he sensed a pressure that could crush any hard matter coming from all directions and acting on his body. Around him was a boundless, dusky existence. This kind of dusky existence contained the characteristics of a chaotic state. Time, space, matter, energy. These four basic existences were mixing together in an extremely strange way. At this moment, the two treasures that were originally in front of him were nowhere to be seen. Just when Luo Fan really woke up and recognized the state he was in, the grayish existence in the surroundings transformed into a vast expanse of absolute nothingness. This kind of absolute nothingness was completely different from all the nothingness that Luo Fan had seen in the past. It was not just the kind of nothingness that had nothing, but it was also a kind of extremely stable nothingness that even his power could not break. In this kind of nothingness, Luo Fan felt that his body seemed to be gradually turning into nothingness and was gradually being devoured by this nothingness. As for him, no matter how strong his power was, no matter how strong his willpower was, he could not shake this nothingness in the slightest. It was as if he had become a powerless, ordinary person. He could only watch as the landslides and tsunamis surged towards him. In fact, even his memories seemed to be about to be devoured by the void at this moment. There were faint traces of memories that continuously dissipated from his body and gradually disappeared. In his shock, Luo Fan tried his best to search for the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Unfortunately, the results of his search were far beyond his expectations. This was because although he could still sense the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, it seemed to be very far away. He could barely sense it, but he could not use it at all. He could not use its power to protect himself. He could not let himself be affected by this nothingness. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan could only give up and place his hopes on the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. His heart moved slightly. He began to guard his mind and tried his best to control his body. He locked on everything about himself and tried his best to resist this extremely terrifying nothingness. It was not that he did not want to resist, but no matter what power or technique he used, as long as it left his body and entered the surrounding nothingness, it would naturally dissipate and be devoured by the nothingness. It would not be of any use at all. Under such circumstances, the only thing he could do was to try his best to resist the erosion of this nothingness. In this process of guarding his mind and body, the speed at which his body and his memories were devoured by the nothingness naturally slowed down. However, this was only slowing down. The nothingness did not stop devouring his mind and body. It continued to push forward in the direction of completely devouring him. In this nothingness, Luo Fan's body seemed to have turned into a steel sculpture that had sunk in his sulfuric acid. It melted bit by bit, and gradually lost its human form. If one were to pull out the perspective and look at this place from an absolute macro perspective at this moment, one could see that Luo Fan was still in his cave abode. However, the surroundings of his cave abode had already been shrouded by a hazy existence. This hazy existence was not the kind that usually existed in the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. In fact, it was not even a hazy existence that simulated the state of chaos. However, it was a formless existence, a product of tribulations. It did not originate from any place in heaven and earth, but from the state of chaos. Moreover, it came from the depths of the state of chaos. It was a place that Luo Fan could not understand, and even true saints could not understand. The product of this tribulation was extremely terrifying. If it were to explode, it could even cause a perfect heaven and earth to fall into the horror of a great tribulation. But at this moment, this grayish existence had appeared here, and even the surrounding Hazy Kong family was not affected by it at all. Even the strands of rules and laws around the cave abode were not distorted because of this, not to mention any changes in the normal heaven and earth. Because of this, at this moment, in this heaven and earth, no living creature, including disciples of true saints like Chiu Daozi, could sense the appearance of this tribulation. For them, everything in this heaven and earth was the same as before. There was no change, and it was still peaceful and comfortable. At the same time, in the hazy space, there was an inexplicable and terrifying aura that filled the hazy space. It created an extremely terrifying effect, and the hazy existence in the entire hazy space seemed to be suppressed. In the blink of an eye, it was completely frozen. The entire misty space was like a portrait or a sculpture that was carved on the space. In a certain space-time dimension, Empty Maiden, who was looking at this special space-time dimension in confusion, was suddenly shocked. What's going on? Why do I suddenly feel like there are millions of worlds pressing on my heart? Could it be that something extremely bad has happened? Chapter 1810. Over the years, Luo Fan was able to move freely between the various space-time dimensions. He could enter and exit as he pleased. In contrast, Air Maiden did not have it so easy. The reason why Luo Fan could come and go as he pleased was that he had obtained his own unique space-time dimension. Relatively speaking, the various space-time dimensions were only on the same level as him. It was just like a person in a house. Under such circumstances, it was naturally relatively easy to enter and exit a space-time dimension. However, Air Maiden could not do that. Before she stepped into this misty space, she did not have much of a feeling for the unique space-time dimension, let alone having her own space-time dimension. In this way, she was equivalent to a part of a house, or a brick, or a piece of tile. In this form of existence, she could only go with the flow. Every time she left a specific space-time dimension, she would need to struggle desperately and undergo various indescribable changes to be able to do so. Therefore, although more than 1,000,000 years had passed in the perfect world that Luo Fan had opened up, Air Maiden had only gone through 3 different space-time dimensions. Every time she left a space-time dimension, she relied more on the space-time dimension's own power and made use of various schemes to make the space-time dimension's power recoil and push her out. She did not completely comprehend her own space-time dimension and adjust herself to escape. At this moment, Air Maiden had almost found the space-time dimension's power and rules. She already had various ideas to use the power and rules to recoil and escape from this space-time dimension. Just like that, she suddenly had this premonition, causing her heart to be incomparably shocked. As someone who had sorted out her own unique worldview, her cultivation realm had already reached the level of a level 3 Supreme Emperor. Air Maiden's control over her mind, premonitions, and intuition was naturally beyond imagination. Soon, she had already tracked down the source of this premonition. Something happened to him. After making a judgment in her heart, her face became increasingly pale. It must be known that Luo Fan had always been her sky and the support for her growth. No matter what happened, as long as she knew that Luo Fan was behind her, as long as he knew that Luo Fan would help him, he would be filled with confidence and would no longer cower. With such a mentality, suddenly discovering that there was a problem with Luo Fan, and now that he was encountering some kind of danger, it was like taking away all her support. It was as if his entire world had collapsed. Impossible. I must be scaring myself, the air hostess thought instinctively. However, despite having such thoughts, he did not show any sign of relief on his face. On the contrary, instead, he revealed a bitter smile. But this was only natural. After all, she wasn't an ordinary woman. No matter how unwilling she was in her heart, he would not let this kind of unwillingness blind his reason. They would not ignore the truth. Because of this, sensing that there might be a problem with her mental support, she looked at the various things she had done in the space-time dimension. Suddenly, he felt a little bored. If that's the case, what's the point of rushing out of this space-time dimension? Aren't we still lost in other space-time dimensions? This thought flashed through her mind. In the blink of an eye, it was overthrown by him. So you are here. At this moment, a voice suddenly rang in the air hostess's ears. This voice was extremely familiar to the air hostess, but deep down, it was indescribably unfamiliar. With a frown, she already knew what was going on. He in this space-time dimension. Immediately, she turned her head to look at the source of the voice. With this look, as expected, an extremely familiar figure appeared. However, there was a slightly different figure at the source. It was the appearance of Luo Fan. Although you look like him, it's a pity that you are not him. The surprise in the air hostess's eyes gradually faded as she sighed. Of course I am not him. The Luo Fan in the space-time dimension smiled and said, however, I should have just separated from him. He was not surprised that the air hostess could recognize the difference in him. This was natural. The Luo Fan in this space-time dimension had also traveled through many space-time dimensions. In fact, he had even exchanged views of the world with Luo Fan in that special space-time dimension. How could a person like him be blind? Putting everything else aside, in other space-time dimensions, almost everyone who was familiar with the creator, who was also the Luo Fan in that space-time dimension, could notice the difference between them. Under such circumstances, how could the air hostess, who was his cultivation partner in another space-time dimension, not notice the difference? You just separated? Do you know which space-time dimension he is from? The air hostess was shocked and asked. Of course I do. Perhaps to you, the space-time dimension is an illusory, special existence that you can't grasp or find. However, in my eyes, they're like fingerprints. They are so unique and clear. Now that you are here, the fingerprints of the space-time dimension on your body can't be more obvious. Why can't I tell? The Luo Fan in this space-time dimension laughed. As he spoke, he waved his hand slightly. The air hostess felt herself sinking into a certain space-time dimension. This space-time was completely made up of all sorts of mysterious and invisible threads. The entire space-time seemed extremely mysterious and rich, displaying all sorts of profoundness that she had not expected. How is he? The air hostess did not pay much attention to this and quickly asked, Isn't he the same as me? That him of yours is at the strongest level in all the space-time dimensions. I'm still far inferior to him. The Luo Fan in this space-time dimension laughed. As he spoke, he condensed an ambrosia unique to the space-time dimension and handed it to the air hostess. The air hostess took the ambrosia, but did not drink it. Instead, she asked, I feel that there's something wrong with him. You are also from another space-time dimension. Do you know what's wrong with him? When a Luo Fan in the space-time dimension heard this, he looked emotional and envious. He said, To be able to transcend the space-time dimension and be sensed by you, there's obviously only one possibility. He's starting to transcend the tribulation. After saying that, he sighed again. I thought that I could close the gap after this cultivation, but I didn't expect to be pulled apart again. If he succeeds in transcending the tribulation this time, he should become the strongest. Transcending the tribulation. The air hostess had already guessed it. When she heard the confirmation from the Luo Fan in this space-time dimension, she could not help but feel inexplicably complicated. She was happy and worried at the same time. This tribulation seems to take a very long time. It might take as long as hundreds of millions of years. I still have a chance to go back and help him. She thought to herself. Her expression became resolute. It seems that you've made up your mind. In that case, I'll send you to the best cultivation place. Seeing this, Luo Fan laughed. The space-time dimension in this space-time dimension had yet to transcend the eighth tribulation. Among them, Luo Fan's imprint that belonged to this space-time dimension had yet to be eliminated. Therefore, in this world, the Luo Fan in this space-time dimension still had almost absolute control. Nothing in this world would be able to escape his control. Under such circumstances, he wanted to find a special place. It was completely suitable for the air hostess to cultivate. It was really as simple as just thinking about it. In fact, there was no such place. With a single thought, he could create it at will. The Luo Fan in this space-time dimension was also cultivation companions with the air hostess in this space-time dimension. But, at this moment, both Luo Fan and the air hostess knew that the other party was not their cultivation companions, although the other party was somewhat similar to their cultivation companions. But the essence was completely different. Therefore, the two of them had nothing to say to each other. At this moment, the Luo Fan in this space-time dimension had already brought the air hostess to a place where the laws were mixed. Here, the laws of time and space were constantly changing in an extremely mysterious way. At every moment, there were all kinds of incredible structures appearing in the space-time laws, almost vividly displaying the mysteries of space-time. It could be said that if an ordinary person came here, even if they only took a glance, it would be enough to support their cultivation until they became immortals. If a powerful cultivator came here, his understanding of space-time would definitely improve by leaps and bounds. In the end, he would reach an extremely profound and unbelievable level. This is where the space-time changes most intensely. It will definitely be beneficial for you to comprehend the changes of the space-time dimension here. The Luo Fan in this space-time dimension left the air hostess's words there. Thank you. The air hostess looked at the sky and turned her head to focus on the laws of time and space. She knew at a glance that this was another core of the laws of this world. This place could be said to be the closest to the Great Tao, but it could also be said to be the furthest away from the Great Tao. Everything that happened here appeared between heaven and earth. However, after countless changes and weakening, they turned into subtle changes that could not be detected by any living beings. It was as if they did not exist. This is indeed the most suitable place for me to cultivate, the air hostess thought to herself as she watched the countless changes of the laws of space-time. At that moment, she no longer had any distracting thoughts. She began to integrate all the changes of the laws of space-time into her senses and compared them with her own worldview. She tried her best to dig out the mysteries of the space-time dimension. I remember that he once said that the first thing I needed to do was to find my own time dimension, then the space dimension, and finally the space-time dimension. Recalling the various teachings that Luo Fan had taught her, the air hostess gradually entered a state where she forgot about everything around her. Time passed by slowly. In the blink of an eye, 10 million years had passed. During these 10 million years, the living beings in this world could faintly sense that the space-time of this world seemed to be undergoing an inexplicable change. However, even the living beings with the sharpest senses and the highest cultivation realm could not discover where the change came from. They had no idea how much the change would affect them. Just like that, as time passed, this change was gradually accepted by all living beings, and it gradually became the normal state of the world in their understanding. Meanwhile, in an unknown place, the air hostess's body had become slightly blurry. Faintly, the flow of time around her body seemed to be undergoing some extremely complicated and unbelievable change. It was as if a certain place had suddenly increased by 10 million times, and a certain place had suddenly decreased by 10 million times. A certain place had suddenly distorted in a strange manner. A certain place had suddenly stopped. All of these were sufficient to cause any cultivator who studied the flow of time to be confused and at a complete loss. On this day, the air hostess's body trembled. She suddenly felt an indescribable sense of comfort. This feeling, is this the time dimension that belongs to me, has mostly taken shape? With that thought, she turned her head and focused her attention around her body. At this moment, light and shadow flowed and changed around her body. Countless strange and distorted scenes made her feel like she had entered a psychedelic world. There was an indescribable sense of comfort all over her body. It was as if she had been immersed in some kind of liquid that bound her, and now her head had finally emerged from the liquid. It was as if she had really breathed in fresh air. This is the feeling of having a unique time dimension. It turns out that this is what he has been feeling all along. An indescribable feeling suddenly surged from the bottom of her heart. She had such a feeling. All of a sudden, she had an inexplicable feeling as if it was transmitted from another time dimension. The indescribable pressure seemed to have weakened a little. This feeling made her feel a little more relaxed, but it was only a little. Before she was completely sure that Luo Fan had overcome the crisis and the great tribulation, she obviously could not relax. At this moment, she quickly focused her attention on the changes of the rules of time and space in front of her. Although the unique time dimension around her body was not as forcefully activated as before, it still existed faintly. However, it was still faintly present, and it still made her feel as relaxed as before. Time passed again. In the blink of an eye, 20 million years had passed. On this day, a buzzing sound came from somewhere in the world. In the blink of an eye, it spread to every inch of the void within an unknown number of trillions of light years. Within this unknown number of light years, all living beings that could not be described by numbers could hear this sound. In the blink of an eye, countless living beings felt dizzy. Their internal organs kept churning, and they faintly felt as if they were going to vomit all of their internal organs out. All kinds of indescribable panic appeared in the hearts of all living beings at this moment. At this moment, another buzzing sound enveloped the entire world. It completely overlapped with the buzzing sound from before, forming an extremely mysterious neutralizing effect. As this new buzzing sound rang out, all living beings felt their bodies lighten. That uncomfortable feeling completely disappeared in the blink of an eye. Looks like it's already a preliminary success. In a certain cave abode in this world, Luo Fan in this time dimension muttered with an inexplicable look on his face. The buzzing sound that appeared for the first time was a result of the time and space laws of this world being stimulated by different space-time dimensions and naturally produced a slight disorder. As for the buzzing sound that followed, he had used his absolute authority in this world to neutralize the effects of the buzzing sound from before. This situation clearly meant that Sky Maiden, who was cultivating somewhere in the core of the law layer, had already formed a space-time dimension that belonged to her. Of course, this was relative to his and Luo Fan's space-time dimension. In other words, this was the beginning of the beginning. Perhaps it would allow her to obtain a sliver of the ability to move between different space-time dimensions. However, it was rather limited. It was not enough for her to enter and exit any space-time dimension as she pleased like Luo Fan. However, this was already extremely rare, so there was no need for him to ask too much of her. At this moment, there was a violent tremor and an indescribable ripple spread out in all directions from somewhere in the space-time. Soon after, a strange distortion appeared in that location. This distortion was like the distortion of time and space. It could be seen, but it could not be touched, sensed, or understood. After a while, the distortion gradually dissipated, and a beautiful woman's figure appeared. Of course, it was Sky Maiden. She sensed her control over her own unique space-time dimension. There was both joy and shock on the Space Maiden's face. She was happy that she had already grasped her own unique space-time dimension. On the other hand, she was shocked when she recalled Luo Fan's various performances back then. She finally understood how far Luo Fan had gone in terms of controlling space-time dimension, and how much stronger he was than her. Congratulations. At this moment, the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension appeared in front of the air hostess and said with a smile, "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I definitely wouldn't have reached this step so quickly." Sky Maiden sighed. "Do you need my help next?" Luo Fan in this space-time dimension asked with a smile. As Luo Fan in this space-time dimension, he had a rather deep understanding of Sky Maiden. Naturally, he knew what Sky Maiden would be thinking at this moment. Since she had already formed her own unique space-time dimension, what she needed to do was obviously to leave this space-time dimension in order to return to her own space-time dimension as soon as possible and help Luo Fan. At the very least, she needed to make him not worry about her and focus on his tribulation. This would increase his chances of success. Chapter 1811. The Luo Fan of this space-time dimension smiled. With a wave of his hand, the void changed and the laws of the world began to undergo an indescribable change. Countless mysterious energies were emitted from it and began to cross layers of barriers, rapidly gathering towards the Air Maiden. In a trance, the Air Maiden's entire body was enveloped by an indescribable energy. This energy was so mysterious and unbelievable that it directly changed the dimensions of time and space, causing the two dimensions to gradually change in a direction that suited the Air Maiden. Of course, it was only moving closer to the Air Maiden's unique space-time dimension, but it was impossible to perfectly fit her space-time dimension. After all, the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension wasn't the Air Maiden, although he could faintly sense the space-time dimension of the air hostess. The specific details and the fundamental essence were completely unfamiliar to him. Even if he exhausted all his strength, he could only barely reduce the difficulty of the Air Maiden changing the space-time dimension. It was impossible for him to truly fit her. The Air Maiden sensed the changes in the surrounding space-time dimension and took a deep breath. She thanked the Luo Fan of the space-time dimension before she began to work hard to display the comprehension that she had gained over the years. The space-time dimension around her began to slowly and arduously change. Along with this change, her figure gradually became blurry. The area around her seemed to be gradually separated from the outside world. An extremely unbelievable barrier gradually appeared. Even the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension felt the changes, but he still felt an indescribable blur. Looks like it's going well. The Luo Fan of this space-time dimension thought as he watched the changes on the Air Maiden's body. He was the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension, so naturally, the Air Maiden of this space-time dimension also existed. But clearly, the Air Maiden of this space-time dimension was still immersed in another space-time dimension and hadn't found her way back. The reason why he was so friendly to the Air Maiden and spared no effort in helping her was because he hoped that the him of the other space-time dimension could also help the Air Maiden that belonged to him. Fortunately, no matter which space-time dimension it was, he was him. After all, although there would be some differences, there would definitely be many similarities in the fundamental essence. The idea of helping the Air Maiden of another space-time dimension shouldn't be too different. Therefore, it was predictable. The air hostess must have received a lot of help. Just as Luo Fan was thinking about this in this space-time dimension, the space-time dimension around Space Maiden, who was enveloped by the mysterious power, finally changed to a certain limit. In an instant, the space-time dimension around her finally produced a mysterious resonance with her body. This resonance gave her an unprecedented sense of contentment and freedom. Then, she felt the world around her repulsed her. This repulsive force acted on her body and pushed her away. Gradually, she disappeared from this world. Not long after, her figure had already completely disappeared. When it appeared again, she was already in that misty space. I'm finally back. This thought flashed across his mind. Then he felt a strong suction force suddenly acting on his body. It sucked at her figure and pulled her towards a certain place in the misty space. In the blink of an eye, he had already disappeared from this misty space and appeared in an incomparably mysterious world. What a pity, looking at the brand new thing in front of him. The air hostess couldn't help but sigh in this completely unfamiliar world. This situation clearly showed that the space-time dimension that she had mastered was still a little different from hers. This difference made it impossible for her to return to her own space-time dimension. She could only continue to sink between the countless space-time dimensions. However, she had already mastered a little bit of her own space-time dimension after all. Therefore, at this moment, she could sense the difference between the space-time dimension and her own space-time dimension. Moreover, the time that she could stay in a misty space was also much longer than before. The world in front of her was a world with a round sky and a square earth. It was so vast that it was simply boundless. Even billions of light years couldn't describe its vastness. In this world, there was an endless aura that belonged to Luo Fan that she was extremely familiar with. This aura, while the air hostess felt contentment, she became even more anxious. Although this aura felt like Luo Fan's aura, the more it reminded her of the calamity that Luo Fan was currently facing, the more she wanted to leave this space-time dimension and return to her own space-time dimension. The more she thought about it, the more anxious she became. Although she had previously received help from Luo Fan from a certain space-time dimension, the air hostess didn't place all her hopes on it. After arriving here, she didn't wait for Luo Fan from this space-time dimension to appear and help her. Instead, she chose a direction and flew out to find a suitable place for her to cultivate. The reason why she didn't wait was because she was independent and didn't have any thoughts of relying on others. Secondly, it was because she didn't know if Luo Fan from the space-time dimension was here or if he had also sunk into another space-time dimension like her. If he had sunk into another space-time dimension and she waited here, wouldn't that be too stupid? Soon, the air hostess found a place where the space-time law was changing rapidly. This place was a forbidden area in this world. Since ancient times, countless living beings and cultivators had died because they entered this place. Within a radius of several light years in this area, the two basic existences, time and space, were in an absolutely strange state. This caused the time and space in this area to be especially different from other places. It could almost be considered as a maze. When the air hostess swept her perception over, she instantly found traces left behind by who knew how many cultivators. Due to the special space-time structure in this area, many cultivators had constructed all kinds of special structural combinations and used their abnormalities to achieve their own goals, such as passing down a legacy or collecting something. For example, it could be used as a cave abode, a place to refine treasures, a place to refine techniques, and so on. Let me see which location has the most drastic change. With that thought in mind, the air hostess released her perception without holding back and carefully searched every inch of the void within a radius of several light years. As she searched, she quickly found what she was looking for. The location was not in the center of this area. It was in a position near the center. The space-time chaos there had reached its peak, even though it could not compare to the state of chaos. In the eyes of all living beings, it already had a hint of the state of chaos. Such a location naturally could not compare to the cultivation place that Luo Fan had specially found for her in another space-time dimension. It could completely display the changes in different space-time dimensions. However, under the circumstances that she was searching, this was the best place she could find. With a thought, the air hostess did not hesitate to step across the sky and walk towards that area. Although the air hostess was slightly inferior to Luo Fan, no matter what, she was still the kind of person who sorted out her own unique worldview. Her cultivation realm had already reached the level of a level 3 Supreme Emperor. To her, any abnormality in this world was just ordinary. This kind of existence was extremely terrifying to living beings in this space-time dimension. To her, it was nothing at all. Thus, in the blink of an eye, she had already passed through space-time and appeared in the most chaotic location. When she stood still, her expression suddenly changed. A look of doubt, curiosity, and disbelief appeared on her face. What a coincidence! I didn't expect that there would be a different space-time dimension where I would also choose this place. At this moment, a cold female voice was heard. She felt that this female saint was extremely familiar, but also inexplicably unfamiliar. It was as if she had heard this familiar voice countless times. However, this unfamiliar voice seemed to be a little different from the one she had heard in her memory. It was obvious that this was her voice. In other words, there was already her in a different space-time dimension here. The air hostess looked around, and her eyes instantly locked on a location that was close to a light year away. Their space-time had combined in an extremely special way to form an egg, or rather a cocoon, that was completely separated from the outside world. Within it, there was an extremely obscure aura that belonged to the air hostess. I also didn't expect to see the me in a different space-time dimension here. The air hostess' expression was somewhat inexplicable. This was the first time she had seen her in another space-time dimension. At this moment, the cocoon formed by time and space gradually dispersed. A figure that the air hostess was extremely familiar with was quietly floating there. The air hostess in a different space-time dimension looked at the air hostess and said, "Fortunately, I changed my mind earlier and didn't leave right after completing my cultivation. Otherwise, I'm afraid I would have missed it this time. Seeing how relaxed you are, it seems that your cultivation partner didn't encounter this second tribulation." The air hostess looked at her in a different space-time dimension, and her expression became even more complicated. Hearing this, the air hostess in a different space-time dimension frowned and said, "Does that mean that your cultivation partner encountered it? How is that possible? It's only been a few years. Didn't you say that it would take at least 10 billion years? The air hostess shook her head and sighed. "How can you be so sure about cultivation?" As they spoke, the distance between them distorted slightly, and they were already only a few feet away from each other. The air hostess was very curious about her in a different space-time dimension. Naturally, the air hostess in a different space-time dimension was also very curious about her. The two sized each other up and gauged the difference in strength between them. The air hostess was much stronger than the air hostess in a different space-time dimension. "Let's have a discussion." The air hostess in a different space-time dimension looked at the air hostess and suddenly smiled. Hearing this, the air hostess nodded. Without any hesitation, a cloud was released above her head. At the same time, the air hostess in a different space-time dimension also released a cloud. Their clouds intersected and started churning at the same time. All sorts of indescribable information kept rushing back and forth between the two clouds in the process. All sorts of indescribable fluctuations were released in all directions, shaking the surrounding space-time and causing all sorts of subtle changes. The location where time and space were abnormal was one that was extremely susceptible to being affected by power. It was affected by the information. Otherwise, it wouldn't have remained in this state for so long. It would have been smoothed out by the laws of the world long ago and returned to its normal state. In this situation, the appearance of this fluctuation caused the surrounding space to undergo all sorts of indescribable changes, and countless profound lights and silhouettes were constantly appearing. Although the two of them were in different space-time dimensions, their reasons for entering this place were the same. Their pursuits were also similar. Under such circumstances, what the two of them were discussing was naturally the mysteries of space-time dimensions and how to transcend space-time dimensions. In this sparring session, this continued for tens of thousands of years. During the past 10,000 years, this place, which had already been labeled as a forbidden area by the cultivators of this world, had become even more dangerous and strange. All sorts of strange sounds and terrifying movements could be heard from time to time. In fact, the occasional living beings that approached this place would have their defenses broken through by accident. It was directly annihilated in the countless changes of time and space. Therefore, unknowingly, there was another name for this place. Forbidden Land of Death, with this name. Of course, it attracted many adventurous cultivators to explore it. However, this also caused many living beings who originally wanted to explore this place to give up on the idea and change their minds. In this way, as a result, this place was much quieter than usual. On a certain day, 10,000 years later, the huge magic cloud above the Empyrean, who was in two different space-time dimensions, trembled slightly and then slowly shrank. It gradually shrank back into their bodies. In the blink of an eye, the two of them had returned to the way they had been when they first met. The sparring session that had lasted for 10,000 years had greatly benefited the two of them. However, the one who had benefited the most was not the Empyrean, but the Empyrean in another space-time dimension. Of course, this did not mean that the Empyrean had suffered a loss. In fact, although the Empyrean had benefited less than the Empyrean was at a higher level after all. Therefore, the gains were closer to the origin. In other words, it was closer to her goal, the mysteries of the space-time dimension. Therefore, in comparison, the aura that lingered around the Empyrean now was somewhat similar to that of Luo Fan, who could disappear in the space-time dimension at any time. The Empyrean in another space-time dimension sighed and said, "I've found the way out. Goodbye." The Empyrean in another space-time dimension sighed and said, previously, if she wanted to leave the space-time dimension, she had to rely on various schemes and the infinite power of this world to do so. However, now, although she was not confident that she could find her space-time dimension, it was not difficult for her to leave it. The Empyrean just nodded. As the Empyrean in another space-time dimension had been here for a long time, there was no need for her to continue to comprehend the mysteries of the space-time dimension. However, she was different. She had encountered the Empyrean in another space-time dimension as soon as she arrived here. She had yet to comprehend the mysteries of this space-time dimension, so she naturally could not leave directly. The Empyrean in another space-time dimension did not say much. Her body swayed, and all sorts of overlapping images appeared on her body. With each overlapping image, the space-time dimension around her body would change a little. When the overlapping went on for hundreds of thousands of times, the space-time dimension finally changed to a state that was completely incompatible with this space-time dimension. Immediately after, a strange force acted on her body, causing her body to gradually become blurry and illusory. Not long after, she had completely disappeared and turned into nothingness. Looking at the Empyrean in another space-time dimension that had completely disappeared, the Empyrean had a slightly disappointed look on her face. Immediately after, she took a deep breath and was about to turn around and focus her attention on the surrounding space-time. At this moment, a strange sound entered her ears. "It seems like I've found it again." She was extremely familiar with this sound. It was her own voice. However, compared to the Empyrean in another space-time dimension, this voice had an indescribable charm. It was cruel and greedy. Instinctively, the Empyrean turned around and slapped at a certain space-time. Boom! An earth-shattering thunderclap erupted from the spot where she had slapped the air. Immediately after, a terrifying shock wave spread in all directions from that spot. In the blink of an eye, the space-time within a range of tens of thousands of miles had been completely minced, turning into smoke that surged outwards. There were many cultivators in the surroundings. The sudden change instantly caused more than half of the cultivators to lose their power. They were either minced by the surrounding space-time power or exploded from their own power and died a violent death. I didn't expect you to be so much stronger than the others. Looks like we'll have a good harvest this time. At that moment, a voice was heard from behind the shockwave. Immediately after, a figure materialized and gradually appeared in that spot. She raised her palm and pointed it at the Empyrean from afar. Clearly, she had also used her palm to block the Empyrean's palm. "It's you? Why?" The Empyrean frowned and asked as she looked at herself in another space-time dimension. Chapter 18:12. "Because what you're doing is something that we would never do," the Air Maiden said faintly. "Yes, this is what all of you must say after hearing this." The Air Maiden from another dimension smiled sweetly. The Air Maiden from another dimension had an indescribable aura around her, vaguely forming an indescribable pressure on her, making her feel like she was facing a natural enemy. But it doesn't matter. After we fuse as one, you will be me, and I will be you, the Air Maiden from another dimension said again. Hearing this, the Air Maiden's expression changed drastically. She suddenly understood what was going on. The Air Maiden from another dimension was actually trying to devour her from another dimension to take something from them in order to strengthen herself. At this moment, the Space Maiden in the alternate space-time dimension took action. She let out a soft roar and slightly raised her hand, making a grabbing motion in the direction of Empty Maiden. As she grabbed, the surrounding time and space underwent some extremely subtle changes, producing an indescribably terrifying power that pressed down on the Air Maiden. At this moment, the Air Maiden felt like her entire body was bearing the weight of billions of space-time. Even her life source was about to collapse in the next instant. Apart from that, she also had an indescribable feeling. Her worldview was suffering an indescribable impact. If she didn't have any way to deal with it, what awaited her would be her worldview being shattered. All of her resistance would be completely eliminated, and everything about her would be devoured. How can I die here? He's still waiting for me to return. Such a thought flashed through the Air Maiden's mind. The power in her body surged, and countless spiritual lights were emitted from her body, forming a long river in the void. As it flowed, it had already enveloped her body. It repelled the terrifying pressure and powerful force exerted by the Space Maiden from a different space-time dimension. Asterisk boom. Asterisk, an earth-shattering tremor spread out from the long river. In the blink of an eye, it traversed hundreds of millions of miles, causing the surrounding space-time to distort even more violently. It caused the chaotic law layer in the surroundings to be torn apart in an instant. It's just an imitation of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. This isn't your real technique. You'll only make a fool of yourself if you take it out. The Space Maiden from the space-time dimension chuckled. She wasn't speaking carelessly, and the truth was just as she said. Now, the air hostess was using a technique. It was indeed just an imitation of the innate, inextinguishable spirit light. The reason for this was because she had cultivated in Luo Fan's innate, inextinguishable spiritual light for so long, and her familiarity with the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light had reached a certain limit. However, this was only an attack that she had simulated after witnessing Luo Fan's methods. The inspiration and the profoundness contained in it were all Luo Fan's. It could be said that this was not her attack, but Luo Fan's attack. As such, if Luo Fan was able to display 120% of the power of this attack, then she would only be able to display 60% to 70% of the power. It's enough to deal with you. That's enough, the air hostess said calmly. After that, the simulated inextinguishable spiritual light shook and condensed. A palm stretched out from it and grabbed at the air hostess from the space-time dimension. In the blink of an eye, the palm that was formed from the simulated inextinguishable spiritual light had penetrated the space-time and arrived above the head of the air hostess from the space-time dimension. Chi. This press directly passed through the air hostess from the space-time dimension. It was like passing through a shadow, but it didn't affect her at all. How is this possible? The air hostess was shocked. Controlling space had the ability to turn illusory. However, that was only for hiding in the gaps of space. It might be able to deal with ordinary attacks. However, it was useless against powerful cultivators. On the other hand, the attack that the Space Maiden unleashed earlier could even shatter a part of the world. No matter what gap one hid in, be it space or time, or even the gap of something even more profound, it was impossible for one to avoid it. However, at this moment, the air hostess from the space-time dimension had already reached this step and easily dodged her attack. How could the air hostess not be shocked? A little difference in the control of the space-time dimension can have an impact on one's strength. It's enough to create a world of difference. The air hostess from the space-time dimension smiled faintly. As she said that, she rushed toward the air hostess unhurriedly. The difference in the control of the space-time dimension. The air hostess's expression changed drastically. After hearing this and recalling the other party's previous actions, how could she not understand that the other party had clearly used the change of the space-time dimension to hide in another space-time dimension in an instant? Only in this way could she ignore the attack that she had simulated with the inextinguishable spiritual light. However, this method was something that she couldn't even touch. From this, it was obvious that the other party's understanding of the space-time dimension was at least one level higher than hers. If I continue to stay here, I'm afraid it'll be dangerous. With this thought in mind, her figure flashed, and she broke through the space-time dimension, heading toward the cave abode of Luo Fan in this space-time dimension. The best way to avoid her was naturally to leave this space-time dimension. However, with the air hostess' current means and strength, it would be impossible for her to leave this space-time dimension in a short period of time unless she had someone to help her. In this space-time dimension, the one who was most likely to be able to help her was, of course, Luo Fan in this space-time dimension. As for whether Luo Fan was in this space-time dimension, she would have to check it out first. You want to look for his help in this space-time dimension? You're wrong. You and I are the same to him. Do you think he will help you to deal with me? The air hostess from a space-time dimension smiled faintly as she watched the air hostess escape. As she spoke, she didn't stop moving. She even took light steps, and the surrounding space-time was constantly changing. Then, her figure chased after the air hostess at a speed that was not any slower than the air hostess. Her words were naturally heard by the air hostess. At that moment, she said, "Maybe, but maybe he will feel that you've ruined my image in this space-time dimension, so he will directly eliminate you." These words, the air hostess from the space-time dimension had a slight change in her expression. Obviously, she was also worried about this. "You're courting death," she said faintly. As she spoke, a ribbon-like light suddenly rushed out of her body. This kind of light was completely condensed by time and space. It completely rejected everything in the universe, including the rules of heaven and earth and the great Tao of heaven and earth. They couldn't penetrate the light ribbon. Such a light ribbon that was condensed by time and space naturally didn't need to be restrained by time and distance. In an instant, it had already penetrated through space-time and arrived near the air hostess. Then, it brazenly stabbed towards her head. An indescribably strong sense of danger instantly emerged in the air hostess' heart. With this sense of danger, she instinctively touched the space-time dimension that she had just achieved. Her body shook, and she turned into a shadow. At this moment, the light ribbon formed by space-time happened to pass through her body. An indescribable fatigue instantly arose in the air hostess' heart, causing her expression to become increasingly ugly. "It's really exhausting." This thought flashed through her mind. At this moment, a surprised and doubtful voice came from behind her. "How is this possible? Did you also devour the self from another space-time dimension?" The light ribbon obviously couldn't last for long. At this moment, it had completely disappeared. At this moment, the air hostess also couldn't bear the erosion of the fatigue. Her body trembled, and she returned to her normal appearance. There was no longer that illusory and shadow-like appearance. "It turns out that you're not as strong as I thought." At this moment, the air hostess turned her head to look at herself from the space-time dimension. An indescribable expression appeared on her face. It was because she had tested it once and realized that although the other party could also use the difference in space-time dimension to dodge her attacks, every time she dodged, she would need to exhaust a large amount of her mental strength, even if the other party was slightly stronger than her. However, how long could she last under this kind of exhaustion? Looking at this scene, the expression of the air hostess from the space-time dimension changed slightly. Originally, she had been so strong in the beginning to strike at the air hostess' confidence. As a result, the air hostess didn't dare to fight with her. Although the space-time dimension was different, they were still the same self. She naturally had a deep understanding of her opponent. Of course, she knew how to strike her opponent the most effectively. "Even if I'm not as strong as you think, I'm definitely stronger than you," the air hostess from the space-time dimension said. As she spoke, her body trembled and turned into a ray of spiritual light. It condensed into a jade hairpin in the void and emitted an eternal and indestructible aura. It suppressed the surrounding space-time, the surrounding rules and laws, and even the great Tao faintly repelled it. This aura was the aura of a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure. However, compared to ordinary pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, this aura was at least 10 times or even 100 times stronger. When it appeared here, it was as if it had turned into the center of the world. It naturally triggered countless changes in the weather. It was unknown how many cultivators from the space-time dimension sensed the changes here. Countless senses spread out from all over the world and quickly swept towards this location. It was a pity that although these senses were not ordinary, they were not simple and were extremely terrifying. However, when they got close to the jade hairpin, or even to a certain distance from the air hostess, they were all crushed. Not a single one of them could truly touch them. All sorts of indescribable panic spread throughout the world at this moment. Faintly, there was a feeling that the entire world was about to undergo an earth-shattering change. However, all of this was meaningless to the two air hostesses. At this moment, they only had eyes for each other. Facing the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, jade hairpin, the air hostess took a deep breath and waved her hands in the air. The space-time within a radius of who knows how many light years began to undergo some mysterious changes under her actions. At that moment, an immeasurable amount of powerful energy quickly gathered towards that spot, turning into a copper mirror in front of her. This bronze mirror, it also exuded an eternal and inextinguishable aura that could not be worn down by 10,000 tribulations. Faintly, the aura released by the jade hairpin was even vaster than the aura released by it. Of course. However, this did not come without a price. At this moment, the space-time within a radius of who knows how many light years had been completely devoured because of the extraction of space-time. All matter, including the creatures that existed within it, had completely disappeared. At this moment, what appeared around the two of them was a vast and boundless void. The pitch-black appearance was like absolute emptiness. And this was not the final change. At the same time, around this area, the normal space-time was also constantly collapsing. It was constantly shattering. More and more space-time was converging into the surrounding void under this change. It was completely crushed and turned into nothingness. From the looks of it, it seemed like it would not stop until the entire world was completely destroyed. Just as the two of them were about to fight, a sigh entered their ears. Can the two of you stop? This world can't withstand your torment. Both of them were extremely familiar with this voice, but both of them felt that it was inexplicably unfamiliar. Following this voice, a vast and boundless power descended from the sky. In an instant, it enveloped the area that was unknown how many light years away. As this power enveloped the area, the unceasingly spreading destruction stopped. Then, with a slight tremble of that power, it was as if time within this huge area was flowing backward. Everything began to mend once again. Not long after, it returned to a normal space-time. Apart from the creatures that could not be resurrected, everything else was the same as before. There was no longer any difference. Following this change, a figure appeared between the two of them. This was the appearance of Luo Fan. In other words, this was the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension. The Luo Fan of this space-time dimension looked at the two air ladies. His face was full of helplessness. Although I don't feel much about the path you two have taken, but please don't fight here, okay? You two are no longer the same as before. The destructive power of the two of you has already surpassed the limit of this world. If you're not careful, this world will be finished. These words caused the air lady of the alternate space-time dimension, who had turned into a jade hairpin, to shudder slightly. She split from the appearance of a jade hairpin to the appearance of a peerless beauty. The air lady breathed a sigh of relief, but she did not release the copper mirror. Instead, she kept it. It was condensed from a huge amount of space-time. If she were to release it now, it would cause great damage to the surrounding world and space-time. Naturally, she could not release it. Moreover, although the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension had intervened, the battle seemed to be unable to continue. But it was better to be safe than sorry. Without the support of some power, she did not have much sense of security after all. The Luo Fan of the space-time dimension said to the air lady of the alternate space-time dimension, although devouring other cells can allow you to quickly understand the secrets of the space-time dimension, and thus return to your own space-time dimension, it is not very useful for cultivation. This is clearly a detour. Why did you choose this? This is my own matter. It has nothing to do with you." The Air Lady of the alternate space-time dimension did not give face to the Luo fan of this space-time dimension at all. The Luo fan of this space-time dimension had clearly expected her to behave like this. After all, although she was his cultivation partner from another space-time dimension, she had nothing to do with him. She was a complete stranger to him, after all. If it were him, he would definitely be unhappy if a stranger were to criticize his path. However, even if she was unhappy, he did not intend to shut up. Therefore, he only said, "It indeed has nothing to do with me. However, I'm a little worried that my cultivation partner will be hurt because of your choice." This caused the Air Lady of the alternate space-time dimension to change her expression greatly. She had never thought of this possibility before. She had always regarded seizing everything from the cells of other space-time dimensions to advance her own understanding of the space-time dimension as a matter between the many selves. She did not expect that this might anger Luo Fan at this moment. When the Luo Fan of the space-time dimension said this, she instantly understood that each of the cells that she had devoured had a powerful cultivation partner. If only they knew what he had done. For a moment, her expression kept changing, and an increasingly dangerous aura was continuously released from her body. "Don't worry, I won't kill you. At least, I don't sense the existence of the aura that I am worried about from your body," the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension said calmly. This meant that the Air Lady of the alternate space-time dimension had not encountered the Air Lady of this space-time dimension. She had not really committed a mistake that he could not forgive. This caused the Air Lady of the alternate space-time dimension to relax. "However, I can't let you walk freely again. You know what I'm worried about." The Luo Fan of this space-time dimension continued to speak. This caused the Air Lady of the alternate space-time dimension's expression to turn ugly again. She naturally understood what Luo Fan meant. Chapter 1813. The empty lady from the alternate space-time dimension floated there quietly, as if she was deep in thought. Suddenly, the empty lady's body trembled, and the space-time around her distorted strangely. The space-time dimension changed billions of times in an instant. Following this change, her body became more and more blurry and illusory. Gradually, she was about to completely disappear from the sight of the empty lady and Luo Fan from this space-time dimension. At this moment, Luo Fan from this space-time dimension sighed. "I can return to this space-time dimension. Do you think that my control over the space-time dimension is inferior to yours?" As he said this, the space-time dimension around the empty lady from the alternate space-time dimension changed naturally, and the process of her leaving this space-time dimension was instantly interrupted. The empty lady, who was gradually turning illusory, became real again. In the end, as if nothing had happened, she appeared in front of the empty lady and Luo Fan from this space-time dimension. "No!" The empty lady from the alternate space-time dimension cried out in shock, and her face was filled with unwillingness. "Next, I will seal you. When my partner returns, she will let you go," Luo Fan from this space-time dimension said to the empty lady from the alternate space-time dimension. As he said this, he waved his hand, and the empty lady from the alternate space-time dimension disappeared without a trace in a flash. However, she had already been moved to an unknown place to be sealed. This world is about to face the 8th Great Tribulation of the world. If you stay here, you will most likely be affected by the tribulation. You should leave this space-time dimension quickly. At this moment, Luo Fan from the alternate space-time dimension said to the empty lady after sealing her, "The 8th Great Tribulation of the world?" The empty lady shuddered. She had seen how powerful the 8th Great Tribulation of the world was. When she heard this, she recalled the powerlessness she had felt back then, and her expression turned ugly. With the empty lady's current abilities, under normal circumstances, she should be able to sense the arrival of the Great Tribulation of the world. However, this space-time dimension did not belong to her. Furthermore, she wasn't the one who had created this world. Under such circumstances, she had no idea whether the Great Tribulation of the world would descend, and if it would, when it would descend. She asked, How much time do we have left? I only have less than 10,000 years left, said Luo Fan, who was in this space-time dimension. If that's the case, then what about me in another space-time dimension? If the great calamity of the world were to descend, there's no guarantee that she would be unscathed. The Space Maiden asked. Luo Fan, who was in this space-time dimension, smiled and said, she's lucky to be able to get through it safely. If I can't get through it, she can only blame it on her bad luck. What he meant was that he didn't care about the empty lady from a different space-time dimension and just let her fend for herself. The air hostess opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, she kept her mouth shut. Although this was a little unfair to her, who was in a different space-time dimension, and it might turn the seal into a killing blow. However, how could he let the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension let him go? Wouldn't that put the empty lady of this dimension in danger? As her Taoist companion, how could Luo Fan of this dimension make such a decision? If that's the case, maybe he from that space-time dimension will chase after me. When that time comes, it will be a disaster for many space-time dimensions. The air hostess sighed. She's in such a hurry to master her own space-time dimension in order to return. This must mean that there's something wrong with the me from that space-time dimension. Either she's about to go through the great calamity, or the heaven and earth of this space-time dimension is about to go through the great calamity of the world. No matter what, the outcome is worrying. The possibility of him chasing after me is not high. These words, the air hostess's expression changed slightly, and a look of realization appeared on her face. Suddenly, she felt an inexplicable sense of loss. This kind of judgment was actually not difficult to make, but she couldn't figure it out even after meeting her for such a long time. In comparison, the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension could see through this so quickly. This was enough to show how big the gap between him and her was. Although the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension was not her Taoist companion, and to her, he was not the real Luo Fan, but after all, he was a very similar existence. With such a big gap between him and the real Luo Fan, it was naturally self-evident how big the gap between him and the real Luo Fan was. This kind of gap made the air hostess admire Luo Fan more and more, and she became more and more proud. But at the same time, for the air hostess who wholeheartedly wanted to help Luo Fan, this also showed that the results of her hard work over the years didn't seem to be as great as she had imagined. This, of course, made her feel disappointed. As the Luo Fan of this space-time dimension, the person in front of her naturally had a very good eyesight. At this moment, he had already seen through the air hostess's thoughts. He couldn't help but smile and said, "Since you're in such a hurry to cultivate, it must be because the me from that space-time dimension is now facing the second great calamity, right? How did you know?" The air hostess was shocked. "I've actually met the me from that space-time dimension not long ago." The Luo Fan of this space-time dimension sighed. This made the air hostess recall the various things that happened when she met the Luo Fan of another space-time dimension. She suddenly understood. "I see, you also participated." "Of course. If I didn't participate, how could I return to this space-time dimension?" The air hostess nodded in realization and didn't continue to ask. At this moment, Luo Fan said, "If you want to return before he completes his great calamity, your current cultivation method won't work." This made the air hostess's expression change slightly. However, although she felt that these words were not very pleasing to her ears, she had to admit that they were indeed the truth. With her current cultivation speed, it was indeed extremely fast for her to find her space-time dimension. However, this speed was still extremely slow for the situation of Luo Fan's great calamity. According to this speed, Luo Fan might have already succeeded in crossing the tribulation by the time he returned, or he might have already failed to do so. "Since you said that, you must have some suggestions," she said. "That's right. Just now, I suggested that you leave this dimension because it's the safest. But if you want speed up, the 8th great tribulation of heaven and earth is your chance." The 8th great tribulation of the heavens and earth. Space Maiden's expression could not help but change. Where there is danger, there is opportunity. Every great tribulation of heaven and earth They all represented dangers that could destroy any living being, but at the same time, they were also accompanied by opportunities that could allow any living being to soar. The eighth great tribulation of heaven and earth would not be an exception. Therefore, Luo Fan of the space-time dimension had said that the 8 tribulations of heaven and earth were her opportunities. She did not doubt this at all. However, she was very clear that the danger was so great that it had practically exceeded the limits of what she could endure. What kind of opportunities are there in the 8th great trial of the world? In the end, the Space Maiden still asked a question that she should not have asked. The 8th great trial of the world will definitely destroy all of my imprints in this world. At that time, the will of heaven and earth will be revealed. At that time, the fundamental origin of this space-time dimension will also be revealed without reservation. If you comprehend it by the side, it will be easy for you to comprehend your own space-time dimension. Luo Fan of this space-time dimension said calmly. He did not know what the 8th great trial of the world would be like before he entered other space-time dimensions and sensed the heaven and earth of other space-time dimensions. It was naturally impossible for him to know. However, after this experience, he had the experience of being in other space-time dimensions. It was no longer a secret to him. At this moment, although he did not know what the specific tribulation would be, he knew that there would definitely be a program that the will of heaven and earth would manifest and force him to destroy his imprints. Space Maiden's expression kept changing. The will of heaven and earth could be said to be the foundation of heaven and earth. It could also be said to be an existence that transcended the foundation of heaven and earth. Such an existence was extremely sensitive to the space-time dimension, observing and comprehending the will of heaven and earth. Although it was different from directly comprehending the space-time dimension, it was not much different. If Space Maiden really comprehended the will of heaven and earth directly, although she would not be able to comprehend more things, her sense of the space-time dimension would definitely be strengthened by a few times or even a few hundred times. By then, she would strengthen her space-time dimension. It would be a simple matter for her to strengthen it to the extent that she could enter and exit any space-time dimension at will. Let's do it. Space Maiden sighed. Luo Fan of this space-time dimension nodded and said, since you've decided to participate, you'll have to prepare yourself. Space Maiden nodded. She turned around and took a step forward. Then, she returned to the location where the space-time was distorted and chaotic. Although the battle between her and her from another space-time dimension had caused this area to be destroyed, it had mostly recovered due to the effect of the rules of heaven and earth. Seeing Space Maiden enter there, Luo Fan of the space-time dimension only smiled. He turned around and took a step forward. Then, he crossed the endless space-time and entered his cave abode. After arriving here, Space Maiden from another space-time dimension was sealed in the deepest part of the space-time like a statue. She had completely lost all senses of the outside world and control over her power. She from another space-time dimension would make such a choice. Then what about me? Would I from another space-time dimension make such a choice? Looking at the sealed Space Maiden from another space-time dimension, Luo Fan of the space-time dimension had such a thought. He shook his head and sighed as he thought about it. No matter what, it would be fine as long as he was prepared. As for the rest, he could not change it before he encountered it. The 8th World Calamity arrived as scheduled. Compared to the 8th World Calamity in Luo Fan and Space Maiden space-time dimension, the Calamity this time was slightly weaker. However, it was still extremely terrifying. During this process, Luo Fan of the space-time dimension had almost exhausted all of his wisdom and all the means that he had accumulated over billions of years. Only then did he manage to barely withstand the world calamity until the final moment, which was also the moment when the world's will of heaven and earth was revealed. During this process, Space Maiden was also exhausted. Her body had been destroyed over 36 times. In the end, she had to rely on her comprehension of the space-time dimension to recover. In contrast, Space Maiden from another space-time dimension was not so lucky. She had been destroyed 623 times in the Great Tribulation of heaven and earth. Although the number of times she had been destroyed hadn't reached the limit that she could endure, that was under the condition that she was in perfect condition. At this moment, while she was sealed, the number of times she had been destroyed had already broken through her defense. This kind of destruction had already broken through her defense. Now, her mind had already sunk into the tribulation. It was difficult for her to extricate herself. She couldn't even send out the thought of reforming her collapsed body. As a result, her entire body turned into smoke, and she was sealed in the cave residence by Luo Fan in this space-time dimension. Like a rolling cloud, she only knew how to tumble, but could not take shape again. During the world calamity, Luo Fan of this space-time dimension could only give Space Maiden some convenience. He could not protect her in all aspects. As for what benefits or fortuitous encounters she wanted to obtain, that was something that she had to fight for and seize by herself. She had to snatch them. Therefore, in the end, Space Maiden went through a lot of hardships and almost destroyed her body several times before she finally broke through the barriers of space-time and arrived at the place where the world's will of heaven and earth was. She saw Luo Fan of this space-time dimension fighting against the world calamity. She also saw what she had dreamed of seeing, the world's will of heaven and earth. So, this is the world's will of heaven and earth. Her eyes seemed to contain countless worlds. Countless worlds flowed endlessly. Countless inspirations, information, and mysteries emerged in her heart in an instant. For a moment, her worldview began to wriggle slightly. She could vaguely sense her growth. She could imagine that if this continued, her worldview would definitely take a huge leap forward. Unfortunately, this kind of opportunity was hard to come by. How could it last for a long time? Not to mention, she knew very well why she had come here. At that moment, she forcibly shifted her attention to the mysteries of the space-time dimension with her strong willpower. So, the space-time dimension has this level. In a trance, the space-time dimension around her body began to change slightly. All kinds of distortions gradually appeared around her body, causing her body to become more and more blurry. This process continued. In the end, after dozens of breaths, her body seemed to be covered by an invisible light cocoon, completely disappearing from this world. Found it. After a long time, Space Maiden let out a long sigh. The space-time dimension around her body that was constantly changing stabilized and fixed in an extremely complicated and abstruse state. At that moment, she felt an unimaginable freedom and freedom. It was as if she had taken off the countless shackles that were originally placed on her body. It was as if she had jumped out of a world with countless shackles. An indescribable joy rose from the bottom of her heart. Is this how he has always felt? So, the gap between me and him was actually so huge. Space Maiden murmured. Her joyful expression was gradually mixed with a little shame and a little admiration. Break. At this moment, a soft cry came from the will of heaven and earth. Then, the entire world began to tremble violently. Wisps of obscure aura began to gradually appear from the depths of the world. Then, they gradually collapsed and dissipated. At the same time, the manifestation of the great calamity of heaven and earth also gradually faded away. Not long after, it completely disappeared without a trace. Then, within the will of heaven and earth, the Luo Fan in this space-time dimension was expelled from the will of heaven and earth through a mysterious channel, completely disappearing from Space Maiden's senses. He's injured. Space Maiden's current perspective was vastly different from before. She could see the situation of the Luo Fan in this space-time dimension at a glance. At this moment, whether it was on the surface or on the inside, he had already suffered a huge blow. It was even possible that his origin had been injured. Moreover, with Space Maiden's current knowledge, even the Luo Fan in this space-time dimension would need tens of billions of years to recover from such injuries. In the end, I still can't compare to him. Space Maiden sighed after weighing the pros and cons. She remembered how relaxed Luo Fan had been when he had helped the world pass through the eighth great calamity of heaven and earth. Let alone being injured, he had even benefited tremendously from it. In comparison, the Luo fan in the space-time dimension might not have been able to recover even after tens of billions of years. Now, he had to hide and rely on various preparations to have a chance to speed up his recovery. The difference was so great that it was shocking. At this moment, a golden light appeared out of nowhere. It directly enveloped every inch of the void, every bit of power, every inch of time, and every inch of space. The entire world began to rapidly transform due to the existence of the light. The world became wider, time became more stable, space became more stable, the world's origin energy became denser, and everything became tougher. Even the potential of the living beings within them had begun to rise by a large margin. Space Maiden had no intention of staying any longer in the face of all this. Chapter 1814. Everything that happened in this space-time dimension had nothing to do with the Air Maiden anymore. She had already traversed through the space-time dimension and appeared in the misty space. Here, all sorts of mysterious pulling forces were constantly acting on her body, pulling her in all directions, trying to make her sink into a certain space-time dimension again. However, this time, she managed to resist the pulling force. The space-time dimension around her body was independent, and all the changes around her were unable to invade this unique space-time dimension that was completely separated from the outside world, let alone pull her in the slightest. The Air Maiden could not help but heave a sigh of relief when she realized all this. This meant that she could already return to her own space-time dimension and find Luo Fan. At that moment, she chose a direction and slowly advanced while withstanding the countless pulling forces around her. After an unknown period of time, she felt her body lighten. She had already arrived outside a misty space. Here, in front of her, light and shadow were distorted, and terrifying waves were emitted from it. They swept past her body, and the misty space behind her penetrated through layers of space-time barriers and penetrated countless rules and laws. They spread throughout the world, causing it to change slightly. I'm finally back. Looking at this scene, how could the Air Maiden not understand that she had returned to her own space-time dimension? Of course, at the same time, she also realized that her previous intuition was correct. At this moment, her Taoist partner, Luo Fan, he had fallen into the second great calamity. Moreover, he was right in front of her, in a place where she could not see, but she could sense the strange waves. What should I do? How can I help you? The Air Maiden murmured. At this moment, the misty space behind her slightly distorted. It gradually became blurry. Soon, it had disappeared without a trace. The entire process was so natural, and there was not the slightest bit of abruptness. It was as if the entire process of its disappearance was a natural phenomenon, like an object falling to the ground, or the sun and moon rising and setting in the west. She waited until it had completely disappeared for a long time. Only then did the Air Maiden feel something. When she turned around, she realized that the misty space had completely disappeared. Looking at this scene, she secretly felt that it was a pity, but that was all. Although the misty space was connected to countless space-time dimensions, she had now mostly condensed a space-time dimension that belonged to her. Under such circumstances, the scenes of the various space-time dimensions were merely a reference to her. Their true value no longer existed. Under such circumstances, whether he did or didn't, it didn't affect her much. And now, the most important thing was obviously Luo Fan, who was facing the second great tribulation of the heavens and earth. At that moment, she only paid attention to the disappearance of the misty space behind her before she began to focus all her attention on the core of the fluctuation in front of her. What should I do? The Air Maiden's expression became a little anxious as all sorts of complicated thoughts surfaced in her heart. At this moment, a strange feeling was born in his heart. The stewardess couldn't help but be pleasantly surprised when she sensed it. At the same time, in the absolute nothingness created by the second Great Tribulation, Luo Fan, who had almost been completely devoured by the nothingness and had almost lost himself, with only the most fundamental core of his life force remaining, suddenly shuddered. An indescribable feeling was born in his heart. This feeling was so familiar and so intimate. It awakened his hazy consciousness that was about to turn into nothingness bit by bit. All sorts of memories that had been devoured by the nothingness began to gradually condense during this process. His origin of life, the materialization of his worldview, also began to gradually grow and evolve towards its original, perfect state. This process was not fast, but extremely slow. However, for the current Luo fan, he had even lost the concept of time, so he naturally did not feel whether it was slow or fast. This would definitely continue until his mind recovered and he finally had the ability to think again. Only then would he be able to change. The space that had originally been hazy had now turned into nothingness, or rather, an empty space. The Air Maiden lay on her side in the air, with her eyes tightly shut. Her breathing was even, but she seemed to have sunk into a deep sleep. Only her body was constantly emitting some kind of mysterious fluctuation, which was retracted, emitted, and retracted. It was as if she was inhaling and exhaling. The ripples that spread out and retracted intersected with the ripples that she could not see or sense in front of her, causing the ripples to undergo an inexplicable change. The borders around her, which were already incredibly difficult to find, now had a wondrous change in the dimensions of space and time, causing a mysterious layer of defense to appear around her. Even if there were living beings and cultivators who discovered this place, they would not be able to pass through the defenses of the dimensions of space and time. If they stepped into this region, they would not even be able to see the Air Maiden or the source of the strange ripples. Time slowly passed during this process. In the blink of an eye, 3 million years passed. On this day, the Air Maiden shuddered, and the presence around her changed drastically. The ripples that spread out and retracted from her body also changed rapidly, and there was a faint hint of joy within them. At that moment, a voice rang out from the invisible space in front of her. "It's all thanks to you that I was able to recover. Otherwise, this alone would have been enough to kill me." The Air Maiden was incredibly familiar with that voice. It was a voice she had been looking forward to hearing for who knows how many tens of thousands of years. It was Luo Fan's voice. "It's good that you're fine." Hearing that voice, the Air Maiden opened her eyes and stood up. The ripples on her body slowly retracted. She mumbled, "Of course I'll be fine. However, I'm a little busy right now. Let's talk after I get through the heavenly disaster." At that moment, Luo Fan's voice rang out from the invisible space again. The Space Maiden naturally knew that the second great calamity shouldn't have passed yet. In fact, it might just be the beginning. She did not say anything else. She merely nodded and quickly retreated. At that moment, in the absolute void, Luo Fan's life origin had been condensed again. It was still in a strange space, and it looked like a strange world. The signs of him being devoured by the void and dying had completely disappeared. He could no longer find them. However, that was only the life origin. Apart from the life origin, everything else, be it his spirit or his body, could not be found at all. He could not find any magic power at all. From the looks of it, it was clear that even though he had awakened himself from the state of nothingness by relying on the little spiritual connection he had with Space Maiden, allowing his life force origin to condense again by relying on his own consciousness, there was still a limit to it. The power of the absolute nothingness formed by the second Great Tribulation was so terrifying that it was not something that he could ignore. The second disaster really isn't simple. This is only the first attack, and I almost couldn't hold on anymore. As such thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan's life origin gradually began to change. The countless laws within it began to operate according to his will, gradually releasing an indescribable light that shone into the absolute void. Behind his life origin, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was silent and motionless, as if it was a phantom. This was because the power of the second tribulation seemed to only be targeting him, so only his power and his body could resist the absolute nothingness brought by the tribulation. Although the innate indestructible spiritual light was extremely powerful, It was still an external object in the end and could not affect the absolute nothingness at all. It was also because of this that Luo Fan could only rely on the connection between him and the air, maiden to break free from the will of the void, and he could not rely on the power of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light to do so. However, he had broken through the erosion of the void. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that his worldview was more than a level more stable than before. This worldview was currently enduring the impact and erosion of the surrounding absolute void, but it was not damaged at all. On the contrary, traces of impurities were constantly being removed. The worldview itself was an extremely complex, complicated, and abstruse existence. When did Luo Fan sort out this worldview? That was when he was only a connate grand heavenly realm. Under such circumstances, the foundation of this worldview, in his current view, after so many adjustments, who could say that there would be no mistakes? However, there were bound to be many imperfections in the structure, not to the point where it couldn't be modified or adjusted. Under normal circumstances, these naturally wouldn't bring about any consequences. But after all, it was a kind of imperfection in the foundation, and if he wanted to climb to a higher level, it would definitely be a hindrance. At this moment, it was these imperfections that broke away from this worldview. At this moment, these structures were constantly being removed like magazines, and the worldview itself began to continuously derive new, more perfect, more exquisite, more concise, and more perfect structures to make up for these structural losses. Under such circumstances, the worldview began to slowly shrink. In the end, after an unknown period of time, the entire worldview had shrunk to nearly half of its original size, however. This shrinkage didn't weaken the power of the worldview in the slightest. On the contrary, the stability of this worldview increased once again. To be honest, at this moment, his worldview was already more than twice as powerful as when he stepped into the second Great Tribulation, and his worldview had completely fused with his origin of life, allowing his origin of life to become the manifestation of the worldview. This kind of improvement also allowed his origin of life to obtain a fundamental improvement. At this moment, he only felt an indescribable sense of security in his heart. Even his understanding of the heaven and earth, the universe, and the state of chaos, all of them had experienced some mysterious and profound improvements, and these were actually all secondary. More importantly, at this moment, he looked at the endless absolute nothingness around him, and the feeling was already different from before. He had finally grasped the traces of the power that belonged to the Great Tribulation in the absolute nothingness. So this is how it works. Looking at the traces of the power of the Great Tribulation in the depths of the absolute nothingness, Luo Fan had an epiphany. As he understood this, his mind gradually dispersed. He fused with the various structures. An extremely shocking repulsive power was emitted from these structures at this moment. It directly acted on his mind, causing his mind to need to expend almost all of its power to truly fuse with these structures. And after fusing, it wasn't the end. This was because the power of the Great Tribulation itself had unimaginable destructive power. As he fused with them, he felt as if his mind was being bombarded by billions of lightning bolts. All kinds of indescribable pain erupted from his mind at this moment and surged into his life origin, making his life origin feel an unimaginable impact at this moment. Even his worldview began to tremble violently at this moment. This experience made Luo Fan feel pure pain, but at the same time, it also made him feel that his view of the world had begun to be tempered once again. There were more imperfections. More imperfect structures were constantly collapsing, evaporating. Brand new, more stable, and more perfect structures were gradually formed. At the same time, the connection between his mind and the world of laws became even tighter. The structure of the power of the Great Tribulation in the absolute nothingness was almost beyond the limits of what could be described with numbers. Even though Luo Fan had faintly sensed their existence, it wasn't something that could be achieved in a short period of time if he wanted to control the structures that were strong enough to collapse the absolute nothingness. Therefore, the duration of this tempering became longer and longer. In the blink of an eye, tens of millions of years had already passed. On this day, an indescribable feeling suddenly emerged in Luo Fan's heart. Under this feeling, he instantly understood. I finally grasped enough structures. At this moment, he discovered that the entire absolute nothingness was no longer a secret to him. How the entire absolute nothingness worked, how to change it, and how to get rid of it, everything became clear in his heart. And at this moment, his worldview had shrunk again compared to before. In comparison, its power was at least twice as strong as it was in the past. With a slight movement in his heart, the worldview began to tremble slightly. Immediately afterward, countless forces were derived from it and began to continuously construct and weave around it. In the blink of an eye, a figure appeared there, replacing the space and time that the worldview had manifested. This was obviously Luo Fan's flesh and blood body. In other words, at this moment, he already had the ability to resist the absolute nothingness, and he could freely restore his body within it. After his body recovered, he felt an indescribable sense of security. At the same time, the different characteristics of his body caused a faint smile to appear on his face. Now, the degree of fusion between his physical body and his worldview of the laws had already reached. He had taken another huge step forward. At this moment, although his body of flesh and blood couldn't be considered as the manifestation of the worldview of laws, it already had some of that feeling. Now, standing here, anyone who saw him would feel as if they were looking at a completely different world. This was the feeling that the worldview of laws gave others after the body was formed. The space-time dimension around it began to change naturally. This change didn't require him to do anything. He didn't need to exert any strength. Just like how humans needed to breathe, humans had different skin types such as yellow, white, and black. Humans also had different attributes such as height, weight, and weight. Compared to Space Maiden's space-time dimension, which required him to adjust with all his strength, it was already much stronger. Apart from the attributes of his body, at this moment, he felt that his strength had increased by several times compared to before. In the past, he would need to rely on the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light to escape from the joint attack of those true saints. Hence, the current him was confident that he could rely on himself to escape from their combined attack. Of course, those true saints were not in an ordinary state, but the state they were in when they activated the life-saving means that the true saints had left for them. If it was just an ordinary state, Luo Fan could easily get rid of all of them. However, although there had been so many improvements, Luo Fan was quite clear that this was not the end of the second major tribulation. In fact, the second major tribulation had just begun. What was coming next was the real second major tribulation. It wasn't difficult to make such a judgment. After all, although his strength had improved a lot compared to before, the real transformation had not happened yet. The essential improvement that should have come from passing the second major tribulation had not yet arrived. Under such circumstances, if he said that he had already passed the second major tribulation, it would not only be an insult to the second major tribulation, but also an insult to himself. With a thought, he casually patted the absolute nothingness in front of him. Chapter 18:15. If it was in the outside world, the terrifying sound that could form a universe of sound waves instantly erupted from countless locations in the absolute void, directly tearing it apart. However, absolute nothingness was absolute nothingness after all. Although the terrifying impact force was enough to tear it apart, the reactionary force ultimately prevented the sound waves from forming a sound wave world. They could only spread in all directions in the form of ordinary sound waves. This also caused Space Maiden, who was not far away, to be abruptly jolted awake. It also caused the space-time dimension defense that Space Maiden had constructed to shatter. You've passed the second great calamity? Space Maiden's eyes lit up when she saw this. However, very quickly, her bright eyes dimmed again. That was because at this moment, all sorts of mysterious energy gathered from the state of chaos. In the blink of an eye, It pressed down on the source of all sorts of fluctuations not far away from her, which was the invisible world. Asterisk boom. Asterisk with a soft sound. The space-time dimensional defense she had constructed completely dissipated. The formless world trembled and revealed its true form. It was a handful of flames. It looked extremely ordinary, just like the ordinary flames that mortals used to cook in the secular world. However, there were a countless number of extremely mysterious symbols vaguely present within the flame. They were like natural rings that continuously produced various changes that even Space Maiden could not see through. What Space Maiden sensed, what Luo Fan sensed, was within the flames. This is the second great calamity. Space Maiden couldn't help but be a little startled when she saw this. At that moment, an indescribable heat rose in Space Maiden's heart. The heat came out of nowhere, but it instantly made Space Maiden feel as if she had turned into a mortal and stepped into a sea of fire. Her entire body, including her life source, was completely enveloped by the flames. Countless terrifying feelings were transmitted to the bottom of her heart in that instant. What she saw, what she felt, it was filled with boundless heat and pain. *T. I've been affected by the calamity. At that moment, Space Maiden suddenly reacted. The moment she reacted, she was even more horrified. Just a glance at the flames had already set her on fire, causing her body and mind to sink into the flames. Even her unique space-time dimension, which had already taken form, couldn't stop it at all. She had already grown for such a long time. Her worldview, which could barely be considered perfect, couldn't produce any effects. She could only allow the flames to incessantly burn and erode her. At that moment, Space Maiden finally understood what kind of terrifying calamity Luo Fan had encountered. At that moment, she closed her eyes without hesitation and began to use all of her abilities and power to resist the burning of the flames. The moment she closed her eyes, the flames that burned her body and mind seemed to have lost their source. She faintly felt a sense of powerlessness, and it was this sense of powerlessness that finally allowed Space Maiden to sense the possibility of successfully resisting the calamity. At that moment, she hurriedly condensed her worldview and tried her best to strengthen her life essence in her fleshly body. She hurriedly gathered her worldview and tried her best to resist the burning flames. Wisps of black mist constantly dispersed from her body. Both her fleshly body and her life force were being consumed during this process. Her body became smaller and smaller because of that. In the end, when she finally extinguished the flames, there was less than 1/10 of her body left. Moreover, this 1/10 wasn't the kind of 1/10 that was left after being cut. Instead, it was the kind where her entire body had been burned to charcoal or even ashes. After such a change, the originally beautiful Space Maiden had become extremely miserable. She was in an extremely miserable state, and she was in an extremely miserable state. She could no longer even be called a human. But even so, her life wasn't damaged because of that. She didn't even need to do anything. Her body's natural recovery ability had already taken effect, allowing her body to rapidly recover. In the blink of an eye, she had already grown back to her normal appearance. She was plump and supple, as if nothing had happened. Of course, if one took a closer look, the light that shone from her eyes was much clearer and purer than before. It also made her aura much more powerful than before. Clearly, this situation was due to the indescribable pain she felt from the flames earlier, forcing her to gather all of her means and strength to resist them. However, it had also given her sufficient benefits, causing her body and mind to undergo a transformation compared to before. But even though she had gained a lot of benefits, the Space Maiden didn't turn her eyes back to the flames. The reason why she was able to resist them was because she hadn't looked at the flames for long. If she were to look at the flames for a little longer, the flames would burn too brightly, and the result would be her body and mind being burnt to a crisp. After all, the flames were the power of the second great calamity, and she didn't even have the ability to trigger the first great calamity. This kind of power to her, was still beyond her limits, she immediately turned around with her back facing the flames. She closed her eyes and restrained her senses. She only focused on sensing Luo Fan from the bottom of her heart and grasping the essence of his existence. In a situation where she couldn't see or sense the flames, or in other words, that world, she could only use this method to grasp the situation of Luo Fan's tribulation. For Luo Fan, who was in the midst of transcending his tribulation, the various changes of the air hostess were too far away. At this moment, he was already in an indescribable place. The absolute nothingness around him had already disappeared a long time ago. After the nothingness disappeared, what appeared was endless flames. In other words, there were endless runes. It was just that when these runes combined, they existed in the form of flames. These flames formed a terrifying world, an incomparably strange world. In this world, he was like a naked baby who had stepped into a mountain of knives and a sea of fire. At every moment, he felt endless pain all over his body. If it was just this pain, although it had an impact on him, it wasn't that big. But more importantly, in this world, there seemed to be an indescribable, invisible force that directly wrapped around his life source. It was constantly extracting all his memories and even his worldview from his life source. And during this extraction process, no matter how he resisted, how he guarded his memories, and how he guarded his worldview, he couldn't stop this change at all. It was as if he had really become an ordinary baby, and he could only face all these changes helplessly with the continuous extraction of this invisible existence. This world made of countless flames, or rather, runes, began to undergo all sorts of mysterious changes. Countless incredible images, countless images that existed in Luo Fan's memory, gradually emerged in his mind. Faintly, there were 7 supreme, eternal, and indestructible auras at the highest level of this flame space-time. They were getting more and more powerful. It formed a stronger and stronger psychological pressure on his mind. Luo Fan's eyes became more and more blurry and hazy. In the end, at a certain moment, his eyes became empty, and as his body collapsed, he completely disappeared. He turned into countless runes that fused into the world, and he could no longer be found. At the same time, in the outside world, the flames that would be strongly eroded by a single glance from the empty maiden suddenly stopped. It turned into an extremely wondrous solid form and quietly stayed in that void. At this moment, the empty maiden had an extremely inexplicable feeling. Why did his aura change? Such a thought flashed through her mind, and a puzzled look appeared on her face. At this moment, she sensed that Luo Fan hadn't disappeared, but his aura had become extremely strange. It was as if a single Luo Fan had suddenly been split into hundreds of millions of Luo Fan. At the same time, an extremely strange feeling came from behind her. It was as if the danger had disappeared. The empty maiden was secretly horrified by this feeling. She had a strong urge to turn around. In the end, she couldn't resist this urge. After making all the necessary preparations, she slowly turned around and looked at the flames. The moment she saw the flames clearly, her pupils shrank. The solidified flames were so beautiful that anyone who saw them could not help but exclaim in admiration. They felt that this was a wonder that shouldn't exist in this world. However, this miraculous scene was unable to erase the worry that existed in her heart at this moment. "What's going on?" the empty maiden murmured. Her face was filled with shock and doubt. She couldn't find the answer, no matter how she thought about it. She couldn't figure out how to help Luo Fan either. She hated her powerlessness again. She gritted her teeth and stood up. He arrived in front of the solidified flames and extended his hand towards the solidified flames. As her hand got closer and closer to the flames, an increasingly strong sense of danger gradually emerged from the bottom of her heart. The strong sense of danger was only a warning at the beginning. However, when her hand was about to touch the flames, the sense of danger broke through her limit. It finally drowned her mind and took control of her body. No matter what she did, She couldn't press her hand down and touch the solidified flames. Damn it, the empty maiden cursed in her heart. She grabbed her right hand with her left hand and tried to pull it down towards the flames. However, it was a pity that even with the help of two hands, she couldn't surpass her limit in the end. She couldn't push her hand down completely. Her body had rejected her order. This situation made the empty maiden feel helpless and shocked at the same time. Even with her control over her body, she was still unable to resist the invasion of the sense of danger. It went without saying how dangerous the flames before her were. However, at this moment, Luo Fan was within it, enduring the invasion of an unknown amount of terrifying danger. It was so much so that he seemed to have already suffered an irresistible injury and was scattered into countless parts. How could she not be overwhelmed with shock? How could she not be worried? After trying for a long time, she could only sigh and retract her hand. At this moment, an inexplicable feeling rose in her heart. This is an existence from another space-time dimension has stepped into this world. She carefully sensed the feeling. The empty maiden's face suddenly changed. Her heart stirred, and she searched carefully. However, he finally saw a familiar figure somewhere in this world. It was her own figure. Obviously, the existence that had stepped into this space-time dimension was not Luo Fan from another space-time dimension. It was her from another space-time dimension. How could this be? The misty space has disappeared. This place shouldn't be intersecting with other space-time dimensions. How could someone from another space-time dimension have entered this space-time dimension? The empty maiden's heart was full of doubts. After the empty maiden from another space-time dimension appeared here, she had an inexplicable look of horror on her face. How could this space-time dimension be so powerful? She murmured. The strength of this empty maiden from another space-time dimension was a notch lower than that of the empty maiden. Her control over the space-time dimension was also much weaker than that of the empty maiden. If one had to calculate, she was probably about the same as the empty maiden who had stepped into the misty space. In this world that had gone through the eighth tribulation of heaven and earth, she was really nothing. In this world that had gone through the eighth tribulation of heaven and earth, she was really nothing. Although there were not many cultivators in this world that could defeat her, the strength and stability of this world itself was enough to have a huge impact on her. It made her unable to control the space-time and the rules of law as easily as she could in other space-time dimensions. However, she was not discouraged because of this. Soon, an excited look appeared on her face. She raised her hand and grabbed the void. Something appeared in her hand. After this thing appeared, a feeling that belonged to a different space-time dimension began to be released crazily and gradually spread in all directions. It brought more and more space-time into its sphere of influence. The area that was brought into its sphere of influence gradually had a feeling that it had formed a solid barrier with the outside world. Through Space Maiden's senses, she clearly sensed that a part of the affected area had been separated and turned into a different space-time dimension. What are you doing? The empty maiden's expression changed slightly when she saw that. In a flash, she had already traversed through space-time and appeared in front of that area. She shouted. Seeing that, the empty maiden from another space-time dimension's expression changed slightly. You've actually returned? How is that possible? It doesn't matter if it's possible or not. It has nothing to do with you. I'm the one asking you now. What are you doing? The empty maiden furrowed her brows. She said, if she had met the empty maiden who wanted to devour the empty maiden from another space-time dimension, she would have been kind to the empty maiden from another space-time dimension. She thought that the empty maiden from another space-time dimension had similar thoughts and attitudes as her, and that there would not be too many conflicts between them. However, it was obvious that after meeting his other self, if he still thought that way, then he would really be a piece of mud that couldn't stick to the wall. He would have lived for so long and cultivated for so long in vain. Seeing that she was on guard, the empty maiden from another space-time dimension frowned and said, Why are you so on guard against me? I am you, and you are me. We should be closest to each other, shouldn't we? As she spoke, she had already stopped moving. The strange air current in her hand had already begun to slowly converge. The surroundings that were changing, or rather, the space-time that was being continuously separated stabilized, and no longer changed. Seeing that, the empty maiden's expression became a little better. At the very least, the current situation showed that the empty maiden from another space-time dimension could still communicate and was not completely on the opposing side. Just now, you wanted to separate this space-time dimension, right? Putting aside the damage to this space-time dimension, your idea is clearly harming others to benefit yourself. If that's the case, how can I treat you as my closest person? The empty maiden said with a frown. The empty maiden from another space-time dimension smiled. You've misunderstood. I'm not trying to separate this space-time dimension. In fact, I can't possibly have such an ability. Right now, I'm just using the magic treasure that I've refined to replicate the mysteries of this space-time dimension. It won't affect this space-time or this space-time dimension much. The empty maiden frowned and said, if what you said is true, then there's naturally no problem. However, how did you step into this space-time dimension? I've already returned, and the space-time dimension's intersection has already left this space-time dimension. You shouldn't have stepped into this space-time dimension. Upon hearing this, the empty lady's expression changed slightly. What? The space-time dimension's intersection has already left this space-time dimension. There's no mistake about this. If you don't believe me, you can sense it yourself. Although you're not strong enough to move between many space-time dimensions, you should still be able to sense the existence of other space-time dimensions after walking through so many space-time dimensions and replicating the mysteries of so many space-time dimensions. Hearing that, the empty maiden from another space-time dimension closed her eyes and began to carefully sense it. In the blink of an eye, indescribable waves were continuously released from her body, and she began to drill into the depths of the void, into the gaps of the space-time dimension. After a long time, the empty maiden's face turned deathly pale. Why can't I sense it at all? It's as if there's no other space-time dimension, she muttered, her eyes filled with panic and terror. Chapter 1817. Now, the question is, how did you enter this space-time dimension? Yes, the air hostess said flatly. If it had only been a short period of time since the hazy space had disappeared, it could still be explained by inertia or a delayed reaction. However, it had been at least 10 million years since then. It was obvious that such an explanation did not make sense no matter how one tried to explain it. I don't know. I just used this magic treasure to enter a new space-time dimension like before, and then I came here. The air hostess frowned and said with a blank look in her eyes. Then, can you try to use this magic treasure to escape? The air hostess frowned. His words made the air hostess from the alternate space-time dimension look excited. Clearly, she felt that this method seemed to be possible. Therefore, she took a deep breath. Without moving, the airflow in her hand began to slowly flow. In the blink of an eye, it had already condensed into a door in the void. The door seemed illusory. It was constantly twisting and couldn't be stabilized. No, right now, this magic treasure doesn't have a complete understanding of the mysteries of this space-time dimension. It's impossible for it to open the door to leave this space-time dimension, the air hostess said. Hearing this, the air hostess frowned and said, maybe that's the truth. But maybe this magic treasure no longer has the ability to leave this space-time dimension. Of course, the space maiden from a different space-time dimension was unwilling to accept this. She just shook her head and said, I won't give up before I try. But I can't let you try now. The air hostess sighed. Why? I'm only replicating the mysteries of this space-time dimension. It doesn't affect the space-time dimension itself. Why can't you let me try? Because I can't confirm whether you're really replicating it now. His words caused the expression of the air hostess from the alternate space-time dimension to turn increasingly ugly, and the two of them fell into complete silence. Then what do you want to do? The air hostess frowned and said, Watch you. The air hostess sighed and said. This made the air hostess feel a little helpless. She said, Watch me. If that's the case, it's meaningless. There was no point at all. If I don't do it, I won't do it if you don't watch me. If I don't do it, I won't do it if you don't keep an eye on me. The air hostess smiled and said, That might not necessarily be the case. As she spoke, she instantly changed the space-time dimension around her body. Following her will, the surrounding space-time dimension gradually turned into a state that was completely compatible with her. The space-time dimension that had been transformed by the gaseous portal was being distorted bit by bit, transforming bit by bit, gradually forming a state that rejected the space-time girl from another space-time dimension. At that moment, the gaseous door trembled slightly. With a loud bang, a terrifying shockwave based on the space-time dimension was released in an instant. This terrifying impact affected the space-time dimension, causing the surrounding space-time dimension to be directly disrupted. However, it did not affect the space-time, and the surrounding space-time within the range of the explosion was not damaged at all. At this moment, the air hostess felt an incomparably powerful force crashing into her body. It was transmitted to him through the changing space-time dimensions around him. In that instant, she felt as if her body was being crushed by the impact. His entire body suddenly collapsed and turned into smoke fragments. It took a long time for him to reform and restore his original appearance. This seemingly disadvantaged appearance did not make her look defeated. On the contrary, the air hostess from another space-time dimension showed a kind of helplessness and a kind of defeat. At that moment, the gaseous magic treasure had already retracted slightly, turning back into a ball and appearing in the hands of the air hostess from another space-time dimension. The impact just now seemed to be unstoppable, and the air hostess could not resist it. But in fact, this was the power that the magic treasure had accumulated for a long time. Once released, although it could not be said to be completely exhausted, it would still weaken the accumulated power. In other words, the impact just now could be said to be the strongest impact of this magic treasure. It was the embodiment of this magic treasure's strongest power. Even the impact just now could not cause any real damage to the air hostess, so this magic treasure obviously would not be able to cause any more damage to her. In this way, it was only natural that the two's current expressions had changed. All right, I admit it. I can't do anything to you now. The air hostess from another space-time dimension sighed and kept the gaseous magic treasure into her body. Seeing her like this, the air hostess was slightly relieved. At the very least, at this moment, the air hostess from another space-time dimension was fundamentally different from the air hostess who wanted to devour herself from another space-time dimension. She would not fall to that level. I have been to many space-time dimensions before, but none of them can compare to this place. If you're interested, I can accompany you to walk around, the air hostess said to herself from another space-time dimension. That's for sure. Since we can't leave for now, it's a must to look around. The air hostess from another space-time dimension sighed. Then she said, Then what about him in this space-time dimension? And I can't make me leave this space-time dimension. But he must have a way, right? Hearing this, the air hostess knew why she had immediately calmed down after a moment of panic, even though she knew that she might be sealed in this space-time dimension forever. It turned out that she had confidence in Luo Fan. However, at least she knew what was good for her. The air hostess also had endless confidence in Luo Fan. She felt that if it was him, no problem would be able to stump him. Therefore, she said, he can't leave for now. When he can, he will naturally come to help you. Hearing this, the air hostess from another space-time dimension had a slight change of expression. She said, Could it be that he is going through the second great calamity? The air hostess was slightly taken aback by this. However, she quickly realized that although the person in front of her was not her, it was her from another space-time dimension. Such an existence, whether it was her or Luo Fan, must have understood her very well and guessed the truth from her words. It was not strange. The change in her expression made the air hostess from another space-time dimension who knew her very well know that she had guessed correctly. She immediately sighed and said, I didn't expect it to be so fast. I finally understand why you were so wary of me. The air hostess did not say a word at this time. Since the other party had seen through her, it was obviously meaningless to deny it. Seeing this, the air hostess from another space-time dimension finally showed a worried expression. If he can't get through the calamity, then won't I? She had this thought in her mind. Her expression became more and more unsightly. The air hostess from another space-time dimension knew the air hostess very well, and the air hostess also knew the air hostess from another space-time dimension well. At this time, with one look, she already knew what the other party was thinking, and for a moment, she was very unhappy. It was as if she was being looked down upon and suspected. She said coldly, "It seems that you don't need his help. I will fulfill your wish." Hearing this, the air hostess from another space-time dimension could not help but change her expression. She hurriedly said, "It's my fault. I shouldn't have doubted him. However, he is not my Taoist companion. I think you should understand." Hearing this, the air hostess's expression softened a little. The reason why she had so much confidence in Luo Fan, besides the fact that Luo Fan had always been unparalleled, was because of his unparalleled strength. More importantly, Luo Fan was her Taoist companion. Because they were Taoist companions and their hearts were connected, she had this kind of irrational confidence. Regarding this, the air hostess was very rational. Naturally, she was very clear about it. With this reason, she could understand the air hostess from another space-time dimension's suspicion of Luo Fan. However, understanding was one thing. Although her expression softened a little, she still did not give the air hostess from another space-time dimension a good look. The air hostess also knew what the other party meant, but she did not take it to heart. She just said, "However, in this case, do you have time to accompany me? He is going through the calamity. Don't you need to stay by his side?" Hearing this, the air hostess's expression turned ugly. She said indifferently, "Indeed, he needs me by his side. However, in comparison, it is more important to guard you and prevent you from causing trouble." Hearing this, the air hostess could only sigh helplessly. In the following time, the air hostess guarded the air hostess from another space-time dimension and accompanied her to wander around freely between heaven and earth. During this process, although she comprehended many things that she had not comprehended before and obtained many gains that she had not obtained before, she was still more concerned about Luo Fan's calamity. If it was not for the fact that the air hostess from another space-time dimension had that strange magic treasure that even she did not have the confidence to suppress, she would have suppressed her long ago. She would not have been dragged here and could only accompany the air hostess to wander around. "Actually, you can bring me along to where he's going through his tribulation. That way, you can watch over me and protect him at the same time. Wouldn't that be the best of both worlds?" Finally, one day, the Space Maiden from another space-time dimension said to the Space Maiden. Hearing this, the air hostess said with an indifferent expression, "Do you think that's possible? Placing a dangerous person like you by his side, is this protecting him or bringing danger to him? You think too highly of me. Do you think that I can bring danger to him?" The air hostess smiled bitterly. Hearing this, although the air hostess nodded to show that she agreed with the other party's judgment, she did not have any intention of bringing the air hostess from another space-time dimension to where Luo Fan was going through the calamity. Seeing this, the air hostess could only sigh. Just like that, hundreds of thousands of years had passed. During this process, the place where Luo Fan was going through the second calamity, which was also the place where the flames solidified, did not change at all. It was as if time had stopped there. After traveling for hundreds of thousands of years, the air hostess' understanding of heaven and earth had unknowingly reached an extremely deep level. She even created all sorts of mysterious cultivation systems according to the various states of heaven and earth and spread them across the world. Some of these cultivation systems were similar to the one that the air hostess had created, but some were completely different. Through these cultivation systems, the air hostess' vision was broadened, and her understanding of the air hostess from another space-time dimension deepened. They had been together for hundreds of thousands of years. Even if they hated each other, they should be able to turn enemies into friends unknowingly and develop feelings for each other. Moreover, the two of them were essentially from the same source. It was just that they were the same person from another space-time dimension due to various experiences and developments. After spending hundreds of thousands of years together, the estrangement between the two of them gradually disappeared. Unknowingly, their feelings for each other had become extremely deep. Unknowingly, they were already like real sisters. However, no matter how deep their feelings were and how little estrangement there was, the air hostess had always adhered to a principle. And that was to keep her, who was in another space-time dimension, away from Luo Fan. Could it be that you still don't believe me? On this day, the air hostess from another space-time dimension sighed. She said to the air hostess, "No, I already believe you." The air hostess shook her head. "Since you believe me, why aren't you willing to let me go with you to protect him?" The air hostess shook her head calmly and said, "It's because I believe you that I'm unwilling to let you protect him. Your logic doesn't make sense at all." The air hostess from another space-time dimension felt helpless. How could normal logic be like this? Was such a strange logic really something that she, who was in another space-time dimension, could obtain? "Because the more I believe in you, the more strange you are." The air hostess finally voiced out her judgment for the first time. And this judgment, instantly, she, who was in another space-time dimension, could not say a word. After spending hundreds of thousands of years together, she had unknowingly forgotten a foundation, a premise. That was, how did the air hostess from another space-time dimension appear in this space-time dimension? What was the mystery? What was the secret? And what was the final impact? He couldn't make sense of all this at all. He couldn't understand it at all. Perhaps this was just an accident, just like the process of Luo Fan transmigrating from Earth to the primordial world, an accident. Or perhaps there was some shocking conspiracy in this that was highly likely to devour all existences in the end. This was strange. Before figuring out this strangeness, no matter how much the air hostess trusted the air hostess in another space-time dimension, it was impossible for her to bring the air hostess to a place that could affect Luo Fan. It seems that there's no other way. At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the air hostess's body in another space-time dimension. This voice was completely unfamiliar to the air hostess. It was a voice that the air hostess had never heard before. Who is it? The air hostess's expression changed greatly. The surrounding space-time dimension instantly changed according to her thoughts and suddenly formed a sealing circle, directly sealing the air hostess in another space-time dimension in front of her. At this moment, the air hostess's expression also changed greatly. Obviously, she did not understand what was happening in her body at all. At this moment, a terrifying power erupted from the air hostess's body in another space-time dimension. The power was so powerful that the air hostess's body instantly exploded, turning her into countless fragments that splashed in all directions in an instant. When this terrifying impact was transmitted, it directly impacted the space-time dimension around Air Lady, who was currently in a different space-time dimension. In an instant, the air hostess's transformation was smashed into pieces. The terrifying power was even more terrifying than the impact of the space-time dimension that erupted from the magic treasure earlier. It directly caused the air hostess's body to explode, turning into countless fragments that almost melted into the space-time dimension. At this moment, a magic treasure that looked like a stream of air appeared out of nowhere. It suddenly curled, sucked, and exhaled, and the air hostess in another space-time dimension reappeared. Then, the air hostess's figure instantly appeared in the void and suddenly appeared next to the air hostess in another space-time dimension. Obviously, the two of them had used their own methods to recover. However, although their bodies and minds had recovered, their expressions were extremely ugly at the moment. It was not just because the impact just now had caused them quite a lot of damage, but also because of the appearance of that impact. I didn't expect him to have hidden some protection on this magic treasure. What a pity that he was one step behind. At this moment, the completely unfamiliar voice spoke again. Following this voice, a figure vaguely formed in the erupting smoke. It was a woman. An indescribable aura wrapped around her. Just her appearance had caused the surrounding space-time dimension to show faint signs of disorder. The woman's face was extremely beautiful, and her figure was well-proportioned and slender. Just by standing there, the entire world seemed to have become much brighter. In fact, even the world seemed to be faintly captivated by her appearance. Strands of light descended from the sky and landed on the woman, making her appear even more beautiful. She had a completely unfamiliar face to the two air hostesses, but the two of them felt an indescribable familiarity with her aura. "Just who are you?" the air hostess said with a cold expression. "It doesn't matter who I am," the woman said indifferently. At this moment, the two air hostesses felt an indescribable pressure envelop their hearts. In a daze, they felt as if they had become ordinary people standing in the dock of a court, as if they were waiting for some sort of trial that would decide their fate. Chapter 1818. Countless thoughts flashed in the minds of the two air ladies at that moment. In a trance, it seemed as though countless doubts in their minds had been answered. "I was able to enter this space-time dimension because of you," the air lady from the billion space-time dimension shouted coldly. "That's right. I've finally asked a more constructive question," the woman said with a faint smile. "It seems like it's really you. What's your purpose in sending me into this space-time dimension?" The air lady from the other space-time dimension shouted coldly again. Hearing this, the woman said indifferently, "What's my purpose? Of course, it's to enter this space-time dimension. Is there need to say it?" The two air ladies' hearts shook when they heard this. They had all sorts of guesses. "There's no need to guess. You're right. I really need to rely on you to enter this space-time dimension. Moreover, sending you here also consumed a lot of my strength. I haven't fully recovered yet." The woman smiled nonchalantly. These words made the hearts of the two air ladies sink. The other party didn't care that they knew about this weakness. This meant that she had absolute confidence. She was confident that even if they knew about this weakness, they couldn't do anything to her. Of all the possibilities, this was the most difficult and troublesome one to deal with. "What are you trying to do by entering this space-time dimension?" the air lady shouted coldly. Apart from lunatics, no one would act without a purpose. The woman in front of them was clearly not a lunatic. In that case, she must have schemed to enter this space-time dimension because there was an extraordinary benefit in this space-time dimension that attracted her. And this benefit was extremely likely to cost her a lot in this space-time dimension. This was what she was concerned about. "Why did I enter this place? That's a question," the woman said with a frown. These words made her look like a lunatic, however, with the terrifying aura on her body. Judging from her extraordinary presence, anyone who treated her as a lunatic would not be able to do anything to her. They were the lunatics. "It's very difficult for me to explain the problem in words that you can understand." The woman seemed to have given up after a while. "However, you just need to understand that this space-time dimension is just a necessary transit for me to return home. That's enough." Then the woman changed the topic and smiled. Those words caused the expressions of the two air maidens to change. Home. They couldn't imagine where this woman's so-called home was. Using the space-time dimension as a transit point and moving from one space-time dimension to another to find the way home was beyond the limits of their worldview. "As expected, you guys really can't understand," the woman said helplessly. At this moment, the woman had already shifted her gaze away from the two air women and started to look around as if she was looking for something. Very quickly, she fixed her gaze on a certain spot in the sky. That position was very normal in the eyes of the space maiden, who was in a different space-time dimension. However, in the eyes of the space maiden, it was as if a shocking thunderclap had suddenly resounded in her ears, causing her to be unable to restrain herself from instantly launching an attack at the unknown woman. In an instant, boundless space-time and boundless worlds suddenly appeared in front of the space maiden. Pushed by her hand, it instantly traversed the void and fiercely crashed towards the woman. At this time and space, this world formed a long river of connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. It rotated naturally in the void, as if it had become the center of this world. Heaven and earth seemed to be rotating along with it. This was a technique that she had cast. It was an unprecedented imitation of connate, inextinguishable spiritual light that was similar to the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. This was also after she had traversed many space-time dimensions. After comprehending the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, it was a brand new technique. Under this technique, the entire world seemed to be on the verge of collapsing in the next instant. Facing such an attack, the woman only smiled faintly. "It seems like I found it." As she spoke, she pressed her hand down on the Space Maiden. In an instant, a mysterious change in space-time appeared in her hand and brazenly collided with the imitation of connate inextinguishable spiritual light that the Space Maiden had released. At this instant, the imitation of connate inextinguishable spiritual light collapsed instantly. All the power seemed to have turned into smoke and dissipated in all directions. The terrifying shock wave and terrifying power that should have exploded seemed to have not existed at this moment. It did not affect or damage the surroundings at all, as if it was just an ordinary light that had been twisted and dispersed. At this moment, faced with such a situation, the two Space Maidens were in disbelief. This is an attack that is completely based on the space-time dimension. How is this possible? The Space Maiden from another space-time dimension was full of shock. Hearing this, the Space Maiden's expression also changed. She also reacted to what exactly was happening. How is this possible? How can this happen? The space-time dimension itself is just an illusory state. How can it have any power? How can someone use the space-time dimension as a form of power to attack and defend? She muttered. At this moment, the woman revealed a faint sneer and said, "A frog at the bottom of a well." As she spoke, her figure flickered and was about to disappear gradually. Faced with this scene, the Space Maiden did not have the time to think about what method she had just used. She shouted, "Stop! I will never let you reach that place." As she spoke, her power spread out, and the world began to shake violently. Endless, terrifying power began to condense rapidly, and the space-time changed. Layers of rules and laws began to produce all kinds of subtle changes. Due to these changes, the woman who was about to disappear seemed to be suddenly slapped out of the void by an irresistible and terrifying power. She broke away from the state of nothingness and reappeared in front of them with her real body. At this moment, she felt that the entire world was repelling her. The entire space-time dimension was repelling her. All of his actions, all of his methods, would create countless accidents that would obstruct him. In this situation, obviously, someone was using the authority of this world to designate her as the absolute enemy of this world. The only thing that could cause such a scene was the strange action that the air hostess made earlier. There is no brand in this world anymore. How can you still have the authority of this world? She said in a tone of disbelief. These words made the pressure in the Space Maiden's heart ease by a lot. "So you don't know everything," she sneered. Hearing this, the woman did not care at all. She said, "Of course I don't know everything. Even if a true saint is known to know everything, it's impossible for him to know everything, let alone me. Thank you for your reminder. I will keep it in mind," the Space Maiden said faintly. "However, this doesn't mean that I have to tell you the answer to the question you want to know." This made the woman's expression turn ugly. She said, "Since you don't want to tell me, I'll beat you until you do." At this time, she actually changed her destination. She originally planned to go directly to the place where Luo Fan was going through the heavenly tribulation, but instead, she went directly to Empty Maiden. In the blink of an eye, a terrifying feeling of being targeted by a natural enemy emerged in the Space Maiden's heart. However, in the face of this scene, the Space Maiden was not worried. Instead, she was happy. For her, as long as Luo Fan was fine, everything would be worth it. The woman in front of her had shifted her target from Luo Fan to her. This brought great danger to her and made her feel as though she was going to be torn apart and devoured in the next moment. However, in comparison, Luo Fan was obviously safe. Naturally, she was happy. In the face of such an attack, she did not hesitate to take action. She opened her mouth and shouted. In an instant, the surrounding space-time and the law layer suddenly formed a huge figure. It suddenly stretched out its palm and slapped the woman. "Flashy but impractical," the woman said faintly. As she said this, the space-time dimension around her body changed slightly. An indescribably terrifying power was released in an instant. The surrounding space-time and the law layer seemed to have turned into ordinary pieces of paper. They were instantly minced and turned into smoke that lingered around her body. On the other hand, even though the palm of the sky lady's figure was much more resilient and could break through the barrier of the space-time dimension's explosion and vaguely show signs of coming into contact with the sky lady's body, it was ultimately just a small sign. As the space-time dimension around the woman's body changed, the palm finally collapsed the moment it came into contact with the woman's body. It disappeared in an instant. At this moment, the Space Maiden only had a faint smile on her face. She was not the least bit upset that her attack had been broken. Just as the woman was wondering if the Space Maiden had been beaten silly, an extremely terrifying power suddenly pressed down on her from all directions. The strength of this terrifying power was secondary. What was more important was that this power contained an incomparably powerful and resolute will. In the face of this willpower, her willpower, which was said to be able to fight against a true sage, collapsed at the first touch. In an instant, she completely lost control of her body and the space-time dimension around her. Under the impact of this terrifying power, all the defenses around her collapsed and disappeared without a trace. Her body was swept into the void in an instant and disappeared without a trace, as if she had never appeared in the first place. Is she dead? Or did she escape? The Space Maiden's heart skipped a beat, and her face was full of doubt. If she was dead, she had died too thoroughly. Not even a speck of dust was left behind. All traces of her existence had disappeared without a trace. This situation was not easy to happen even for an ordinary person. Moreover, the woman in front of her was an existence who was much stronger than her. However, it was obviously impossible for her to escape. After all, she was very clear about the attack that the woman had encountered this time. It was an attack that came directly from the willpower of the world. This kind of attack could only be avoided by leaving the world. Otherwise, no matter where she went, it was impossible for her to avoid it. How is this possible? At this moment, a voice was heard in the void. This was indeed the woman's voice. However, at this time, the voice was no longer as relaxed and satisfied as before. There was only an indescribable fear and uncontrollable panic in it. It was as if she had encountered something unbelievable and unimaginable. This is in another space-time dimension. After all, the Space Maiden was an existence who had traveled through many space-time dimensions. She instantly recognized where the voice came from. When she heard where the voice came from, she naturally understood. What method did the woman use to avoid the attack from the willpower of the world? She had used her control of the space-time dimension to slightly deviate from the space-time dimension and hide in another space-time dimension. At this moment, a violent vibration was heard in the void. Along with the tremors, a large cloud of smoke spread out from that location and began to surge in all directions. After a long while, it finally condensed back into that woman's figure. At this moment, an eye appeared in the sky. This eye seemed to be extremely indifferent. It also seemed to contain endless emotions. It was just that this kind of emotion was incomprehensible to ordinary creatures. That was why the eye seemed indifferent. The appearance of this eye instantly caused all kinds of subtle changes in the surrounding space-time. It was as if everything had suddenly changed. This place had become a special place that was completely separated from the outside world. At this moment, it was practically impossible for even the Sky Maiden to leave this place. The woman's expression became increasingly ugly. She said, "It's the willpower of the world. I didn't expect you to have a way to trigger the willpower of the world." Her words contained a kind of resentment that made her gnash her teeth. However, she did not dare to shift her eyes away. He just stared at the huge eye above him. At this moment, the body of the Space Maiden from another space-time dimension trembled. She shouted, "Hey, we are quite close. No matter what, we have a pretty good relationship. Why am I in the attack range?" At this moment, the Space Maiden said indifferently, "As the trigger, I am also in the attack range. How can you be an exception? Are you crazy? I don't object if you want to die with her and contribute to your cultivation partner. However, I have no obligation to accompany you. Hurry up and let me out." The empty lady from the other space-time dimension shouted. At this moment, she only felt that the eyes in the sky had already locked onto her. An indescribable pressure came from the eyes at this moment, directly pressing down on her soul, making her feel as if her soul was unable to bear the heavy burden. Gaga, 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 sounds were constantly coming from her soul. Forget about just how terrifying the attack that was about to be unleashed was. Just the pressure from being stared at by this pair of eyes was already sufficient to cause her to feel the danger of imminent death. "I'm sorry, I can't do anything about it," the Space Maiden said apologetically. However, this was only on the surface. In fact, her eyes were full of gratification and joy. At this moment, she was extremely grateful to Luo Fan from another space-time dimension. If Luo Fan had not thought of a way to help her to directly observe the will of heaven and earth when she was going through the eighth tribulation of heaven and earth in another space-time dimension, she really would not have been able to do anything this time. Because she had directly seen the will of heaven and earth, she vaguely knew some characteristics of the will of heaven and earth. She vaguely knew how to instill her thoughts into the will of heaven and earth. That was why she could obtain a little authority of the heaven and earth and make the will of heaven and earth treat the woman in front of her as a great enemy of the heaven and earth. The will of heaven and earth indeed had spiritual intelligence. However, this kind of spiritual intelligence was completely different from the spiritual intelligence of all living beings. According to the knowledge of Luo Fan and the Space Maiden, only true saints could understand this kind of spiritual intelligence. Logically speaking, no one, even the Space Maiden, could communicate with the will of heaven and earth. The reason why the Space Maiden could do this seemed unbelievable, but it was actually quite simple. The will of heaven and earth and living beings were like humans and insects. Normally, humans would not be able to make insects understand their words, and insects would not be able to make humans understand their thoughts. However, it was just like how humans could train insects to treat certain places as their nests and to collect certain things and place them in certain places through various means. Insects could also let humans know what they hated by biting and stinging people. Living beings and the will of heaven and earth could also achieve simple communication through various indirect methods. What the Space Maiden did was to communicate with the will of heaven and earth like how insects communicated with humans. It was also because the nature of the communication was so simple and crude that it resulted in the current situation. The attack was clearly triggered by the Space Maiden, and the will of heaven and earth was triggered by the Space Maiden. However, the Space Maiden had also fallen into the same situation as the person she wanted to attack.